Consider the unsettling reality that your mind, that fortress of personal identity and autobiographical truth, is capable of constructing entire experiences that never actually occurred, memories so vivid and emotionally resonant that they feel as authentic as the genuine recollections stored within your consciousness. Yet they are nothing more than fabrications woven from suggestion, imagination, and the malleable nature of neural pathways. In landmark studies conducted by psychologists like Elizabeth Loftus and her colleagues, researchers demonstrated repeatedly that false memories could be implanted in the minds of unwilling participants through a remarkably simple process called the lost in the mall technique, wherein subjects were told detailed stories about childhood events that their families confirmed never happened. Yet after several sessions of guided imagery and repeated exposure to these fictional narratives, many participants began to report genuine memories of these non-existent occurrences, complete with sensory details and emotional authenticity. The mechanism behind this phenomenon operates through the brain's fundamental reliance on reconstruction rather than recording, meaning that each time you access a memory, your mind does not simply retrieve a stored file, but rather reassembles the experience from fragments of information scattered across neural networks. And during this reconstruction process, the boundary between what actually happened and what your mind has inferred or imagined becomes surprisingly permeable and unreliable. What makes this particularly disturbing is that false memories are not easily distinguished from true ones by the person experiencing them, as they activate similar neural pathways and generate the same sense of confidence and certainty that accompanies genuine recollection. And the more vividly you imagine a false event, or the more emotionally engaged you become with a suggested scenario, the more likely your brain is to encode it as a real experience, essentially cementing fiction into your personal history. Despite understanding these mechanisms through decades of rigorous psychological research, we continue to rely heavily on eyewitness testimony in legal proceedings, trust our own memories implicitly in our daily lives, and remain largely unaware of how easily our minds can be manipulated into remembering things that never happened. And we construct our sense of self and identity almost entirely upon these unreliable and constantly shifting recollections of our past. This vulnerability becomes even more troubling when we consider how it intersects with the power of suggestion in therapeutic settings, where well-intentioned practitioners might inadvertently guide clients toward recovering memories of trauma that never occurred, or how social media and repeated exposure to false narratives can collectively implant shared false memories across entire populations, fundamentally altering our collective understanding of historical events and personal truths that we collectively misremember with unwavering conviction. The implications extend beyond individual psychology into the realm of institutional and cultural consequence. Entire populations have developed shared false memories of events they never witnessed, from details of famous crimes to the specifics of historical moments, all reinforced through repeated media exposure and collective retelling, until the fabricated version becomes indistinguishable from fact in the public consciousness. Perhaps most paradoxically, the very act of becoming aware of false memories' possibility does little to protect us from falling victim to it, as knowledge alone cannot inoculate the brain against its own reconstructive tendencies and suggestibility. Imagine waking up one morning with an unshakable conviction that you are dead, that your body is nothing more than a walking corpse animated by some inexplicable force, and that no amount of evidence to the contrary will convince you otherwise. This is the lived reality of individuals afflicted with Cotard's delusion, a rare psychiatric condition where patients become absolutely certain of their own death despite being fully conscious, mobile, and capable of rational thought in nearly every other aspect of their lives. The condition typically emerges following severe trauma, brain injury, or in conjunction with other psychiatric disorders, and those who suffer from it report an overwhelming sense of detachment from their physical form, describing their bodies as cold, lifeless, and fundamentally wrong in ways that defy logical explanation. Some patients refuse to bathe because they believe corpses should not be cleaned, while others reject food because they argue that dead bodies have no need for nourishment, and still others isolate themselves completely, convinced that their presence will cause harm to the living around them. The neurological basis of this condition involves profound disruption in the brain's ability to integrate sensory information with emotional recognition, particularly in regions responsible for bodily awareness and self-perception, creating a catastrophic disconnect between what the mind knows logically and what the mind believes to be true on a deeper, more fundamental level. What makes Cotard's delusion particularly haunting is its remarkable resistance to reality itself, for patients possess full access to mirrors, to their own reflections, to their heartbeat, to their warmth, yet none of these experiences penetrate the iron conviction that they have ceased to exist. And this persistence of false belief in the face of overwhelming contradictory evidence reveals something deeply unsettling about the human mind's capacity to construct and maintain entirely alternate realities that feel more true than truth itself. In recorded cases, patients have been known to lie motionless for hours, testing whether their bodies will decompose or to deliberately harm themselves to prove their deadness, operating under a twisted logic that only physical damage can validate what they already know to be true. This condition stands as a stark reminder that the mind's grip on reality is far more fragile than we typically assume, and that consciousness itself can become the very prison from which escape seems impossible. The tragedy deepens when we consider that modern psychiatry often struggles to treat this condition. For how does one convince someone they are alive when their own neurobiology has become their most convincing argument for death, leaving therapists to navigate a labyrinth of delusion where logic itself has been weaponized against the patient's own survival? Some patients have reportedly requested to be buried or cremated, viewing these acts not as suicide, but as the final acceptance of a reality they believe has already occurred, while others have spent years in psychiatric institutions, their conviction unshaken despite every intervention, becoming living monuments to the mind's capacity to reject its own existence with a certainty that rivals the certainty most of us feel about being alive. Yet perhaps most profoundly, Cotard's delusion forces us to confront an uncomfortable philosophical question. If the mind is absolutely convinced of something that contradicts all external reality, at what point does consensus reality cease to matter, and does the subjective experience of being dead become, in some terrible sense, a kind of death itself, not of the body, but of the person's ability to ever truly inhabit the W? Imagine waking up one morning to find that the person lying beside you, the one who has shared your bed for 20 years, has been replaced by an identical imposter who has somehow fooled everyone around you. This is the lived reality of those experiencing Capgras delusion, a rare neuropsychiatric condition in which a person becomes absolutely convinced that someone close to them, typically a spouse, parent, or child, has been replaced by an exact duplicate or imposter. The affected individual can look directly into the face of their beloved family member, recognize every physical feature with perfect accuracy, acknowledge that this person knows intimate details of their shared history, and yet remain entirely certain that this is not the real person they know and love. What makes this condition particularly unsettling is that the conviction is not accompanied by confusion or doubt. Rather, it exists as a fixed, unshakable certainty that persists despite all logical contradictions. The person experiencing Capgras delusion can provide no satisfactory explanation for how the substitution occurred or where the real person has gone, yet they remain unmoved by any rational argument or evidence presented to them. The mechanism behind this disturbing phenomenon lies in a profound disconnect between the emotional and cognitive systems of the brain. Research suggests that in Capgras delusion, the brain's facial recognition systems remain intact, allowing the person to consciously process and identify familiar faces. Yet simultaneously, the neural pathways responsible for generating emotional recognition and the warm feeling of familiarity fail to activate. This creates a bizarre cognitive gap where the mind registers the correct face, but receives no corresponding emotional signal that confirms this is indeed the person they love, resulting in the brain constructing an elaborate explanation to resolve this mismatch. The person must be an imposter. It is as though the brain, unable to tolerate the contradiction between clear recognition and absent emotional familiarity, generates a false belief as a desperate attempt to restore internal consistency. What is deeply unsettling is how this condition reveals the fragility of our sense of identity and recognition, how dependent we are on emotional resonance rather than mere visual confirmation, and how our brains will construct elaborate deceptions to protect us from cognitive dissonance, even when those deceptions cause tremendous suffering to ourselves and those around us. In some cases, patients have harmed or even killed those they believe to be imposters, driven by a desperate need to protect themselves or locate their real loved ones, transforming this neurological paradox into a genuine tragedy. This tragic potential underscores how the architecture of our brains, the delicate balance between perception, emotion, and belief, ultimately determines not just what we think is real, but what we are willing to do about it. And yet, perhaps most poignantly, there exists no cure that can simply restore the missing emotional connection. Only management through medication, therapy, and the patient's gradual acceptance of a reality their own mind refuses to validate, leaving both sufferer and loved ones trapped in an impossible limbo where recognition without feeling becomes its own form of exile. In rare instances, some patients have reported that the delusion gradually weakens over time, or that they develop a kind of dual awareness, intellectually accepting their loved one's identity while emotionally remaining unconvinced, a compromise their psyche negotiates to prevent complete rupture of relationships. Imagine waking up one morning to discover that one of your hands no longer belongs to you, that it has developed its own consciousness, its own agency, moving without your permission or awareness, performing actions you never intended, grasping objects you never asked it to hold, reaching toward things you consciously want to avoid. This is the terrifying reality of alien hand syndrome, a rare neurological condition where one hand behaves as though it is controlled by an external force, by something other than the person's own will and intention. Patients report watching their hands move into their pockets, adjusting clothing, touching their face, or even unbuttoning their shirts while their conscious mind screams in protest, helpless to stop these involuntary movements. The hand might reach out and grab someone without the person's knowledge, might perform complex tasks like writing or gesturing, might even seem to argue with the other hand, one reaching for an object while the other simultaneously tries to put it back. The individual is fully aware that this is their own physical hand, attached to their own arm, yet they experience it as fundamentally alien, as though a separate being has somehow inhabited their limb and stolen control from them. The condition typically emerges following a stroke, brain surgery, or significant damage to the corpus callosum, the neural highway that connects the brain's two hemispheres and allows them to communicate and coordinate their functions. When this crucial connection is severed or damaged, the two sides of the brain can no longer properly synchronize their motor commands, and the hemisphere controlling the affected hand loses its integration with conscious awareness and intentional decision-making. The hand continues to receive neural signals, continues to move and act, but these signals are no longer aligned with the person's conscious desires or conscious sense of self. What makes alien hand syndrome profoundly disturbing is how it reveals the fundamental fragmentation underlying human consciousness, how it demonstrates that our sense of unified agency is actually a carefully maintained illusion constructed by a brain that is far more divided than we typically acknowledge. The condition forces us to confront the unsettling truth that consciousness is not a single, unified phenomenon emanating from a single control center, but rather an emergent property of multiple brain systems that are usually coordinated but can be dramatically decoupled. Most people move through life believing they are singular, unified beings with complete control over their bodies. Yet alien hand syndrome exposes this belief as an evolutionary accident of neural organization that can be disrupted in moments. The condition persists in the medical literature and in the lives of those who experience it as a reminder that the boundary between self and not self, between voluntary and involuntary, between intention and action, is far more porous and negotiable than conscious experience would suggest. Some patients describe their alien hand as possessing distinct preferences and even a personality. One woman's hand consistently reached for cigarettes she consciously wanted to avoid, while another's hand would repeatedly attempt to strangle her, forcing her to physically restrain it with her other hand in a bizarre internal struggle for bodily autonomy. In these moments, the patient becomes a spectator to their own flesh, forced to negotiate with a limb that seems to have forgotten it belongs to them. The tragedy of alien hand syndrome is that it demands a reckoning with the possibility that we are never truly singular beings, that selfhood itself may be a fiction our brains tell us to maintain the illusion of coherence in a fundament. When the corpus callosum, the massive bundle of neural fibers connecting the left and right hemispheres of the brain, is surgically severed to treat severe epilepsy, something profoundly unsettling occurs that challenges our fundamental understanding of consciousness and identity itself. Patients who undergo this procedure, known as a corpus callosotomy, retain most of their normal functions and can walk, talk, and interact with the world much as they did before. Yet beneath this veneer of normalcy exists a fragmented consciousness that researchers have spent decades documenting and attempting to comprehend. In carefully designed experiments, neuroscientists discovered that when information is presented exclusively to one hemisphere, the other hemisphere cannot access it, creating situations where the two sides of the brain appear to hold different beliefs, preferences, and knowledge simultaneously. For instance, when researchers flash an image to only the right hemisphere of a split-brain patient, the patient's verbal left hemisphere, which controls speech, will deny seeing anything at all, yet the right hemisphere can still point to or select the correct image when given nonverbal options, suggesting that two separate streams of awareness and intention exist within a single skull. The left hemisphere, which typically dominates in language and analytical thinking, will sometimes confabulate explanations for behaviors initiated by the right hemisphere, inventing plausible-sounding reasons for actions the patient did not consciously choose, as if the speaking part of the mind is constantly narrating a unified story that it does not fully understand. This raises the haunting question of which hemisphere represents the true self, or whether the self is merely an illusion created by the dominant hemisphere's compulsion to construct a coherent narrative from the disparate actions and impulses generated by two semi-independent brains sharing one body. Despite decades of neuroscientific evidence demonstrating this duality, we continue to experience ourselves as singular, unified beings, never doubting the absoluteness of our individual identity and consciousness, suggesting that the brain's most fundamental trick may be convincing us that fragmentation does not exist within our own minds. Yet this illusion of unity may be so essential to our sense of self that the brain actively suppresses or integrates any evidence of its own multiplicity, leaving us forever unable to directly perceive the fractured nature of consciousness that split-brain patients can only dimly apprehend through carefully constructed experimental conditions. In this way, the very architecture of the brain that creates consciousness may simultaneously obscure our ability to truly know what consciousness is. Perhaps this is why split-brain patients themselves rarely report feeling divided or disturbed by their condition. Their unified sense of self persists even as objective evidence reveals two distinct conscious agents operating within their singular mind, suggesting that the experience of being one person may be less about actual neural integration and more about the brain's unwillingness to permit conscious awareness of its own bifurcation. This stubborn persistence of unity despite neurological evidence of division suggests that consciousness itself may not be a property that emerges from integrated neural activity, but rather a narrative retrospectively imposed upon behavior, a story the brain tells itself about itself that may be fundamentally disconnected from the actual mechanisms generating thought and action. Imagine you are standing on a train platform, waiting peacefully for your arrival, when suddenly and without warning your mind produces a vivid image of pushing a stranger onto the tracks in front of an oncoming train, an image so clear and disturbing that it startles you, makes your heart race, and fills you with profound guilt and shame, even though you have absolutely no desire to harm anyone and find the thought absolutely repulsive. Or perhaps you are holding your infant child, feeling nothing but love and protectiveness, when your mind suddenly generates a horrifying scenario involving harm coming to that child, a thought so unwanted and distressing that it causes you to pull away, to question your own safety as a parent, to wonder if something is deeply wrong with you as a person. These are intrusive, violent thoughts, and research suggests that the vast majority of the population, somewhere between 80 and 90% of all people, experience them at some point in their lives, yet very few people discuss them openly because the thoughts feel so personal, so revealing of some hidden darkness within the self. The psychological mechanism behind intrusive thoughts operates through a fundamental principle of human consciousness. The more you try not to think about something, the more your brain activates the neural pathways associated with that thought, a phenomenon known as ironic processing or thought suppression rebound. When you actively attempt to push away a disturbing image or idea, you are paradoxically keeping it in your working memory, rehearsing it, strengthening its neural connections, making it more likely to return again and again in unexpected moments. Your brain, it seems, does not distinguish well between thoughts you want to think and thoughts you are desperately trying not to think, because both require activation of the same mental networks. Additionally, the mind has a tendency to generate random associations and images as part of its normal operation, a kind of constant background noise of potential thoughts and scenarios, And occasionally this random generation process produces content that directly contradicts your values, your intentions, or your sense of self, which is precisely why it feels so startling and wrong. What makes these thoughts persist despite their logical disconnection from actual desire is the anxiety response they trigger, because the very fact that you find a thought disturbing creates a feedback loop where fear and guilt reinforce the thought's salience, making it more memorable, more likely to resurface, and more resistant to the natural mental processes that would otherwise allow it to fade away like ordinary passing thoughts. Yet society has largely normalized the anxiety response to intrusive thoughts, often interpreting them as signs of actual danger, actual desire, or actual character flaws, when in reality they are merely the brain's random noise made momentarily visible by the peculiar intersection of consciousness and fear. The path forward involves a counterintuitive shift. Rather than fighting these thoughts or treating them as meaningful indicators of who you are, research in cognitive behavioral therapy and acceptance and commitment therapy suggests that the most effective response is to acknowledge the thought's presence with curiosity rather than judgment, to observe it as you might observe a cloud passing through the sky, noticing it without grabbing onto it, without struggling against it, and without allowing its appearance to define your character or your safety as a person. Consider the experience of waking in the dead of night to find yourself completely unable to move, your body locked in place as though held down by invisible hands, your breathing shallow and labored while your mind races with primal terror. This phenomenon, known as sleep paralysis, occurs during the transition between sleep stages when your conscious mind awakens, but your body remains in the state of muscular atonia that naturally accompanies REM sleep, the stage during which most vivid dreaming occurs. During these moments of profound vulnerability, many people report sensing a malevolent presence in the room, often describing a dark shadowy figure standing at the foot of the bed or sitting upon their chest, sometimes perceived as demonic or otherworldly in nature. The paralysis typically lasts anywhere from a few seconds to several minutes, though to the person experiencing it, time seems to stretch into an eternity of helplessness. What makes this experience particularly disturbing is the way the mind constructs these hallucinations in response to the neurological mismatch between wakefulness and sleep. Your brain, suddenly conscious but unable to receive feedback from your voluntary muscles, interprets the sensory deprivation and the chemical state of REM sleep as a threat, essentially manufacturing a terror narrative to explain the inexplicable immobility. The amygdala, your brain's fear center, becomes hyperactive during this state, flooding your system with adrenaline and dread while simultaneously preventing your body from responding. Throughout human history, cultures worldwide have independently reported these entities with remarkable consistency, describing them as demons, incubi, night hags, and shadow people, each culture interpreting the same neurological event through its own supernatural lens. What proves most fascinating is how this knowledge rarely diminishes the experience for those who encounter it, as understanding the mechanism provides little comfort when faced with the raw visceral terror of absolute helplessness and the presence of something that feels undeniably real. Even those who have experienced sleep paralysis multiple times and can rationally identify it as a neurological phenomenon often find themselves gripped by the same primal fear when it strikes again, suggesting that some terrors operate beneath the reach of logical understanding. In this way, sleep paralysis demons represent a unique intersection of neuroscience and the human condition, a reminder that our minds remain capable of manufacturing experiences so convincing that reason becomes merely a spectator to our own terror. The phenomenon serves as a humbling testament to the fragility of the boundary between perception and reality, a boundary that, when breached, reveals that our subjective experience of the world is far more constructed and vulnerable than our waking confidence might suggest. Perhaps this is why sleep paralysis demons persist so powerfully in human culture. They are not merely neurological glitches to be explained away, but profound encounters with the limits of our own understanding. In this way, sleep paralysis becomes a doorway into understanding how our ancestors, lacking modern neuroscience, transformed a neurological accident into mythology. How the same experience that inspired tales of demonic visitation in medieval Europe manifested as the pinyin spirit in traditional Chinese medicine or the baktak in Persian folklore. These cultural interpretations, though scientifically explicable, capture something true about the experience itself, that we are fundamentally alone with our own consciousness, and that consciousness can betray us in ways both fascinating and deeply unsettling. Consider the moment you decide to raise your hand or speak your thoughts or choose what to eat for dinner. That sense of agency that floods your consciousness, where you feel as though you are the author of your own actions and the captain steering the ship of your life through deliberate choice and intention. Neuroscientists have discovered something deeply unsettling about this experience, something that challenges the very foundation of how we understand ourselves as conscious beings capable of autonomous decision-making. When researchers monitor brain activity using functional magnetic resonance imaging, they can predict what decision a person will make up to 10 seconds before that person becomes consciously aware of having made the decision at all, which means the neural machinery of choice is already in motion, already committed to a path, before your conscious mind experiences the subjective sensation of choosing. The brain appears to be making decisions through unconscious processes, through the firing patterns of neurons and the activation of neural networks that operate entirely beneath the threshold of awareness. And only after these processes have already determined a course of action does consciousness arise with the convincing illusion that it made the choice, that it deliberated and decided. This mechanism likely evolved because consciousness is slow and resource-intensive, and having a lightning-fast unconscious decision-making system that feels like conscious-free will keep us responsive to our environment while maintaining the psychological stability that comes from believing we are in control. The brain essentially tricks itself, generating the subjective experience of free will as a post hoc narrative, a story it tells about decisions that were already made by processes beyond its conscious reach. Yet we persist in believing in free will with almost religious fervor. We hold people morally responsible for their actions. We punish criminals based on the assumption they could have chosen differently. We praise ourselves for achievements and blame ourselves for failures, all while the neuroscience quietly accumulates evidence that this entire framework may be built on an illusion so fundamental that removing it would perhaps destabilize the entire architecture of human society and consciousness itself. And yet in this paradox lies perhaps a deeper wisdom, that the illusion of free will may be just as functionally important as free will itself would be, that the story we tell ourselves about agency and choice is not a mere epiphenomenon, but rather a constitutive element of human experience, a necessary fiction that allows us to navigate a causally determined universe as if we were genuinely free, thereby making us free in the only way that ultimately matters. Perhaps this is why the illusion persists despite our knowledge of it, because the moment we truly believed we had no free will, we would lose the very psychological coherence that makes us human, and so consciousness maintains its beautiful deception, allowing us to live as though we are free even as we understand the mechanisms that make that freedom impossible. This paradox mirrors other foundational illusions that structure human life: the self as unified and continuous, time as flowing forward, meaning as inherent rather than constructed, suggesting that consciousness may be fundamentally organized around comforting fictions, and that perhaps the deepest truth is not that free will is false, but that the distinction between illusion and reality breaks down entirely when examining the machinery of subjective experience itself. Consider a moment in which you reach out to touch a hot stove, and your hand recoils from the surface before you consciously register pain. You experience the withdrawal, the physical reaction, the movement of your muscles away from danger, and only then does the sensation of burning consciously arrive in your awareness. This temporal gap between what your body does and what your mind knows it is doing represents one of the most unsettling truths about consciousness itself, a delay that exists not in milliseconds, but in the very structure of how your brain processes experience. Neuroscientists have measured this delay extensively, finding that your brain requires anywhere from 300 to 500 milliseconds to construct a coherent conscious experience of events that have already occurred in the external world, meaning that every moment of conscious awareness you believe you are experiencing in real time is actually a reconstruction of something that happened a fraction of a second ago. Your brain, through mechanisms not fully understood, takes sensory information that has already passed, integrates it with memories and predictions and emotional associations, and presents it to your consciousness as though it were happening right now, creating a seamless illusion of simultaneity. The mechanisms behind this delay involve multiple processing stages through which sensory information must travel, from the peripheral nervous system through relay stations in the thalamus, distributed across various cortical regions for processing and integration, with each stage requiring time to encode, transmit, and combine information into a unified perception. Yet despite this objective, measurable, neurologically verifiable delay between reality and awareness, consciousness persists in feeling immediate and direct and primary to us, as though we are directly perceiving the world as it occurs rather than experiencing a delayed neural reconstruction. We have normalized this temporal gap to such a profound degree that it remains almost entirely invisible to us, operating beneath the threshold of introspection, so completely integrated into our sense of self that most people live their entire lives without recognizing that they are perpetually experiencing the past rather than the present moment they believe they occupy. This hidden lag becomes even more profound when you consider that your sense of agency, your conviction that you consciously decide your actions and then execute them, may itself be a post hoc narrative your brain constructs after your body has already begun moving, a story of authorship told retroactively to a consciousness that arrives too late to have actually authored anything. In this view, the self you experience as the author of your life is less like a pilot steering a ship and more like a passenger reading a detailed account of the journey written by neural processes that have already charted the course. Yet this revelation need not diminish the reality of your experience. Rather, it invites you to question whether the immediacy you feel is actually necessary for consciousness to matter, or whether consciousness might be something far stranger than a window onto the present, a narrative device through which your brain makes meaning from a past that has already been written by the time you become aware enough to read it. If consciousness is indeed a narrative constructed after the fact, then perhaps its primary function is not to control the present moment, but to create coherence and continuity across time, to weave the disconnected fragments of neural processing into a story that feels like a unified self persisting through a continuous world, and in doing so, to transform the objective chaos of sensory data into the subjective ord. In the early 1960s, a psychologist named Stanley Milgram conducted a series of experiments at Yale University that would fundamentally challenge our understanding of human morality and individual agency, revealing a deeply troubling capacity within ordinary people to inflict harm when placed under the authority of an institutional figure. The experimental setup was deceptively simple. Participants were told they were taking part in a study about learning and memory, and they were assigned the role of a teacher who would administer electric shocks to a learner in another room whenever that learner gave an incorrect answer, with the shocks increasing in intensity with each mistake, ranging from mild discomfort at the lower end to what appeared to be dangerous and potentially lethal levels at the highest settings. The learner, who was actually an actor and never received any real shocks, would respond with increasingly desperate pleas and screams as the voltage supposedly increased, begging the participant to stop, expressing heart pain, and eventually going silent as if unconscious or dead. What Milgram discovered was profoundly disturbing. Approximately 65% of participants continued to administer shocks all the way to the maximum level, despite hearing the learner's anguished cries and pleas for mercy, continuing only because an authority figure in a white lab coat calmly instructed them to proceed and told them they had no choice, they must continue. The psychological mechanism underlying this obedience appears to stem from a fundamental human tendency to defer responsibility to authority figures and to internalize institutional hierarchies, a survival mechanism that likely evolved because following the guidance of established leaders and structures often increased chances of group survival throughout our evolutionary history. When people are embedded within a system that appears legitimate and authoritative, they experience what researchers call an agentic shift, a mental state in which they relinquish their personal moral judgment and view themselves as merely the instrument through which authority is being expressed rather than as autonomous moral agents responsible for their own actions. This explains how ordinary, compassionate people who would ordinarily refuse to hurt another human being can find themselves pressing buttons that deliver excruciating pain, all while experiencing profound cognitive dissonance and internal distress, yet continuing nonetheless because the institutional context has somehow suspended their usual ethical framework. What remains most unsettling about the persistence of this pattern in human behavior is that despite decades of awareness of the Milgram experiments and extensive educational efforts about the dangers of blind obedience, we continue to see instances throughout history and in contemporary life where people commit harmful acts under the direction of authority figures and institutions, suggesting that intellectual knowledge of our capacity for such obedience does very little to prevent us from falling into the same patterns when we find ourselves within powerful institutional contexts and hierarchies. From the Holocaust to modern interrogation practices, from corporate malfeasance to medical ethics violations, the shadow of Milgram's findings looms large, suggesting that the capacity for obedience-driven harm may be less a quirk of individual psychology and more a fundamental vulnerability embedded in the human condition itself, one that no amount of historical awareness seems capable of fully eradicating. Consider the haunting case of Kitty Genovese, a young woman who was attacked and murdered on a street in Queens, New York in 1964, while numerous neighbors heard her screams and cries for help echoing through the night. Yet not a single person called the police or intervened in any meaningful way. And though the exact details of witness count have been debated and revised over decades, the core psychological phenomenon remained starkly apparent and undeniable. When multiple people are present at the scene of an emergency or crime, the likelihood that any single individual will take action to help decreases substantially, a phenomenon psychologists call the bystander effect. And this cognitive and social mechanism operates through several interconnected pathways that diminish personal responsibility and accountability. The first mechanism is diffusion of responsibility, wherein each witness unconsciously assumes that someone else in the crowd will take action, that the burden of intervention is shared equally among all present, and therefore their own personal obligation is proportionally reduced, creating a psychological escape route where no single person feels uniquely accountable for what unfolds before them. The second pathway involves pluralistic ignorance, where individuals look to the reactions of those around them to determine how serious the situation actually is. And if everyone appears calm or uncertain, each person interprets this collective hesitation as a signal that the emergency may not be genuine or severe enough to warrant risk or disruption, even when the facts clearly suggest otherwise. Additionally, there exists a profound social inhibition against public action, as people fear appearing foolish, panicked, or inappropriate in front of strangers, and this fear of social judgment can paralyze witnesses more effectively than any external force, keeping them frozen in silent observation even as life and death situations unfold. What renders the bystander effect particularly unsettling is that it persists even among people who understand it intellectually, even among those who have studied it extensively and are fully aware of its mechanics, suggesting that our psychological wiring operates at a level beneath conscious rationality and deliberate choice. We have constructed urban environments where anonymity is common and social bonds are thin, where large crowds are routine and interpersonal connection is fleeting, and in such conditions, the bystander effect flourishes with terrible efficiency, transforming ordinary citizens into passive witnesses to extraordinary suffering, and we have somehow accepted this as an inevitable feature of modern existence rather than a systemic failure worthy of genuine resistance and change. Yet perhaps the most disturbing implication is that prevention remains entirely within our collective grasp. We need only recognize that the bystander effect is not an immutable law of human nature, but rather a choice we make through our inaction, and that acknowledging our complicity is the first step toward building communities where intervention becomes the default rather than the exception. The question then becomes not whether we are capable of change, but whether we possess the moral courage to restructure our social norms, our urban planning, and our educational systems in ways that actively incentivize intervention rather than passivity, and whether we can cultivate a culture where the burden of inaction feels heavier than any social awkwardness or personal risk that accompanies stepping forward to help. In 1971, psychologist Philip Zimbardo conducted what he believed would be a 2-week study examining the psychological effects of imprisonment, recruiting 24 college students to participate in a simulated prison environment constructed in the basement of Stanford University's psychology building, with half the students randomly assigned to be guards and the other half to be prisoners. And what unfolded over the course of just 6 days became one of the most disturbing demonstrations of how quickly ordinary people can abandon their morality when placed in positions of power or subjugation. The guards, who had been given minimal instructions beyond maintaining order, began to systematically dehumanize the prisoners through psychological torment, enforcing arbitrary rules, conducting surprise searches, and stripping inmates of their individuality by assigning them numbers rather than allowing them to be called by their names. While the prisoners, faced with this authoritarian regime, began to either rebel violently or retreat into learned helplessness, with some experiencing emotional breakdowns so severe that they had to be released from the study early. The psychological mechanism driving this transformation operated on multiple levels simultaneously. The removal of normal social constraints through role-playing allowed participants to act out fantasies of power or submission they ordinarily would suppress. The ambiguity of the situation meant there were no clear ethical guidelines to reference. The deindividuation created by uniforms and institutional language weakened personal accountability. And the artificial hierarchy established an unstable social dynamic where those with power felt compelled to exercise it, and those without power experienced genuine fear that normalized compliance. What makes this collapse of civilization so psychologically significant is that these were screened, psychologically healthy college students, not predisposed to cruelty, suggesting that the situational factors themselves were powerful enough to override the moral intuitions most of us assume are fundamental to who we are. And decades later, we continue to see echoes of this pattern in organizational hierarchies, military structures, and systems of institutional control where ordinary people commit extraordinary cruelties not because they are fundamentally evil, but because the structure itself permits and even encourages such behavior. And perhaps most unsettling is how we have largely normalized this finding as simply how human nature works, rather than recognizing it as a warning about the fragility of our ethical frameworks. Yet the tragedy of the Stanford prison experiment extends beyond its findings. Subsequent scrutiny has revealed that Zimbardo himself may have actively encouraged the guards' brutality, whispering suggestions for psychological torture, and occasionally role-playing as the prison superintendent, raising uncomfortable questions about whether the study demonstrated an inherent human capacity for cruelty or merely documented how authority figures can manufacture it through deliberate manipulation and implicit permission. This methodological corruption transformed what was meant to be a neutral observation of human behavior into a self-fulfilling prophecy, contaminating our understanding of situational ethics for decades and forcing researchers to confront an uncomfortable paradox: that the very act of studying human nature under artificial conditions may fundamentally alter it, leaving us uncertain whether we ever truly discovered what the Stanford prison experiment was supposed to reveal. Every time you recall a memory, you are not retrieving a perfect recording of what actually happened, but rather reconstructing it piece by piece from fragmented traces scattered throughout your brain, and with each retrieval, you are inadvertently altering that memory in subtle and sometimes profound ways. When you remember an event from your past, your brain doesn't simply play back a video file as you might expect, but instead gathers together various sensory details, emotional impressions, contextual information, and narrative threads from different regions of your cortex, weaving them back together into something that feels complete and coherent, yet is fundamentally different from the original experience. During this reconstruction process, your mind fills in gaps with information that seems logical, with details borrowed from similar experiences, with things you've learned or been told about the event afterward, and sometimes with completely fabricated details that never happened at all, but that your brain invented to make the memory feel more complete. What makes this phenomenon particularly unsettling is that you have no way of knowing which parts of your memory are accurate and which parts are reconstructed or invented, because the reconstructed memory feels just as vivid, just as real, and just as trustworthy as any other memory in your mind. Research has repeatedly demonstrated that eyewitness testimony is remarkably unreliable, that people confidently remember events that never occurred, that they can be led to recall false details through suggestive questioning, and that traumatic memories are especially prone to distortion and contamination from post-event information. Yet despite overwhelming scientific evidence that memory is malleable, reconstructive, and prone to error, we continue to trust our memories implicitly, to base major life decisions on them, to use them as evidence in legal proceedings, and to let them define our sense of self and identity. We normalize this fundamental unreliability by assuming that our most emotionally significant memories must be the most accurate ones, when in fact the opposite is often true, because emotional arousal actually impairs the formation of precise memories while enhancing the formation of gist-based, narrative-driven recollections that are more prone to distortion and contamination over time. This means that the memories you cherish most, a parent's last words, a transformative conversation, a moment of profound loss, are often the most substantially altered versions of events, filtered through layers of emotional significance, retelling, and the brain's relentless drive to construct a coherent narrative rather than preserve objective truth. And yet, paradoxically, these distorted memories may matter more to who you are than the actual events ever could, because your identity is not built from what happened, but from the story you tell yourself about what happened. So you are, in a very real sense, continuously rewriting your own history with each act of remembrance, becoming a different person than you were before, shaped not by what actually occurred, but by the versions of those events that your brain has chosen to preserve and repeatedly reconstruct. This means that the person you were yesterday is not truly accessible to you. Only a reconstructed approximation exists in your present mind. And the person you will be tomorrow will be shaped by how you remember today, not by what today actually was, creating an endless loop where memory becomes destiny, where the past is perpetually rewritten by the present, and where the self is nothing more than the story currently being told. Consider the deeply unsettling case of a patient who has suffered damage to their primary visual cortex, the region of the brain responsible for conscious sight. And yet when researchers place an object in their blind field and ask them to guess its location or describe its properties, they respond with uncanny accuracy far beyond what chance would predict, all while insisting they cannot see anything at all, that they are merely making random guesses in the darkness of their perception. This phenomenon, known as blindsight, reveals a terrifying truth about the architecture of human consciousness. That vision can occur without awareness, that your brain can process visual information, navigate around obstacles, recognize faces, and even respond emotionally to what it sees, all while your conscious mind remains completely ignorant of these visual experiences unfolding in the depths of your neural machinery. The mechanism behind this phenomenon lies in the existence of alternative visual pathways that bypass the primary visual cortex entirely, roots that evolved long before conscious vision emerged in our evolutionary history, pathways that connect the eyes to ancient brain structures like the superior colliculus and other subcortical regions that were handling visual information millions of years before consciousness ever arrived on the scene. These older systems can still detect motion, locate objects in space, and even process certain emotional content from images without any input from your conscious visual awareness, meaning that your brain is constantly seeing things that you, in your conscious experience, are completely blind to. What makes this phenomenon so deeply strange is that it persists as a fully functional system despite offering no conscious experience whatsoever, suggesting that consciousness itself may be almost superfluous to vision, that your subjective experience of sight might be merely a late addition to visual processing rather than its foundation or necessity. And yet we continue through our lives convinced that seeing and conscious awareness of sight are one and the same thing, never questioning the possibility that we are already blind to vast portions of the visual world that our brains are actively processing. Consider that every saccade your eyes make, those rapid jumps between points of focus, creates a blind spot that your conscious mind fills in with an illusion of continuous vision, or that you cannot see the sharp details in your peripheral vision despite feeling as though you can, and you begin to realize that blind sight is not an anomaly, but rather an extreme case of something your brain does constantly. Processing visual information in the darkness of your unawareness, constructing a seamless conscious experience from fragmentary scraps while leaving the vast majority of visual computation entirely hidden from your subjective view. And perhaps most unsettling of all, this hidden visual processing may not be limited to patients with cortical damage. Your own conscious sight may be merely the visible tip of an iceberg of visual computation, the brain's curated highlight reel selected from a vast archive of visual data that never reaches awareness, leaving you to move through the world convinced you see everything while remaining fundamentally blind to the machinery that makes seeing possible at all. The neuroimaging evidence suggests that these unconscious visual pathways may even influence your conscious perceptions and decisions in ways you'll never detect, guiding your gaze toward threats you don't realize you've seen, steering you away from obstacles your conscious mind believes you navigated through pure luck, making you the unwitting passenger in a vehicle piloted by systems far older and more efficient. Imagine you are having a conversation with someone in a crowded room, and mid-sentence, that person's shirt color changes from blue to red, or their hairstyle transforms entirely, yet you notice nothing amiss and continue the conversation as though nothing has occurred at all. This phenomenon is known as change blindness, and it represents one of the most unsettling limitations of human perception and attention. In controlled laboratory settings, researchers have demonstrated this effect repeatedly by showing subjects images or video footage where significant elements change between frames, yet the vast majority of observers fail to detect these alterations until they are explicitly pointed out to them. One particularly famous experiment involved a film in which actors were swapped mid-conversation, yet viewers focused on the dialogue and facial expressions were entirely oblivious to the replacement. The mechanism behind change blindness reveals something deeply troubling about consciousness itself. Our brains do not actually perceive our visual world in the comprehensive, detailed manner we believe they do. Instead, attention acts as a spotlight, illuminating only the elements we focus upon while leaving the periphery in a state of relative darkness and inattention. When changes occur outside this spotlight of attention, our brains lack the detailed prior information necessary to detect the discrepancy. The brain essentially assumes continuity in our environment, filling in gaps with expectations rather than relying on actual sensory data, a process so seamless that we remain utterly unaware we are doing it at all. What makes this phenomenon particularly unsettling is that despite understanding change blindness intellectually and being aware of its existence through scientific literature and popular demonstrations, we cannot override it through willpower or conscious effort alone. Even when warned that changes will occur, even when incentivized to detect them, even when the changes are dramatic and obvious in hindsight, our attention continues to fail us in predictable ways. We navigate the world operating under the profound illusion of complete visual awareness, when in reality our perception is fundamentally fragmented and selective, held together by assumption and inference rather than actual observation. And we continue this existence without the slightest sense of the narrowness of our true perceptual window. This realization becomes even more unsettling when we consider its implications beyond the laboratory. Eyewitness testimony in criminal cases, medical diagnoses where crucial symptoms are overlooked, or the countless moments in our daily lives where we fail to notice the gradual transformations in ourselves, our relationships, and our world, all while maintaining an unwavering confidence in the accuracy of our perception. We exist in a state of perpetual incompleteness, our minds constructing an illusion of seamless reality from fragmented attention and educated guesses, yet we cling to our perceptions with absolute certainty, unaware that the world we believe we see so clearly is largely a product of what we expect to see rather than what is actually there before us. The tragedy of change blindness is that it operates most powerfully in the moments that matter most, when a loved one's subtle shift in demeanor signals emotional distress, when a patient's gradually worsening condition goes unnoticed until crisis strikes, when the slow erosion of our own values and priorities occurs beneath the threshold of our awareness. In this sense, change blindness reveals not merely a flaw in perception, but a fundamental vulnerability in how we understand ourselves and navigate our relationships with others. Imagine you are watching a video of two teams passing a basketball back and forth, and you have been explicitly instructed to count every pass that the team in white shirts makes while ignoring the team in black shirts, a task that demands your full concentration and attention as the ball moves rapidly between players in a confined space. As you focus intently on your counting, something extraordinary happens that seems impossible once you become aware of it. A person in a gorilla suit walks directly across the court, pounds their chest, and walks off screen, yet up to half of all observers report seeing absolutely nothing unusual. They complete their counting task and remain entirely oblivious to the massive primate that crossed their field of vision. This phenomenon is called inattentional blindness, and it reveals a deeply unsettling truth about human perception that contradicts our intuitive understanding of how our eyes and brains work together. We believe that if something is directly in front of us, we will see it, that our visual system operates like a camera recording everything in our field of view, but the reality is far more selective and fragile than this assumption allows. Our brains do not passively receive visual information from our eyes like some neutral recording device. Instead, they actively filter and prioritize what deserves conscious attention based on our current goals and expectations, allocating limited cognitive resources to the task at hand while relegating everything else to the periphery of awareness. When you're fully engaged in a demanding task like counting basketball passes, your brain essentially constructs a tunnel of attention, channeling nearly all processing power toward that specific objective, and anything that falls outside the boundaries of that tunnel, even something as improbable and conspicuous as a gorilla, simply fails to register in your conscious experience, because your attentional system has effectively rendered it invisible. The mechanism operates through a combination of top-down attention, where your conscious goals direct what you perceive, and the limited capacity of working memory, which can only handle a certain amount of information at any given moment, meaning that the more demanding your primary task becomes, the more likely you are to miss unexpected stimuli entirely. What makes this phenomenon particularly unsettling is that it persists even when we are explicitly aware that it exists. Even after people learn about inattentional blindness and understand how their attention works, they continue to experience it in their daily lives, missing important details, overlooking dangers, and failing to notice significant changes in their environment simply because their attention was directed elsewhere. We have normalized this blind spot in our perception, building our societies and safety systems around the assumption that people will notice important things. Yet the evidence overwhelmingly suggests that our visual awareness is far more limited and conditional than we would like to believe, and this gap between our confidence in our perception and the actual fragility of our attention remains one of the most humbling discoveries in cognitive psychology. Radiologists miss obvious tumors on X-rays they have examined thousands of times before, drivers fail to see motorcycles directly in their lane, and parents absorbed in their phones walk past their own children in crowded spaces. Each instance a small reminder that attention is not a searchlight that illuminates everything in its path, but rather a spotlight that can only illuminate one area at a time, leaving the rest of the world temporarily invisible to us. Consider the moment when a crime occurs in public and dozens of witnesses watch it unfold before their eyes. Each person sees the same event, yet when police officers later interview them separately, their accounts diverge dramatically. One witness describes the perpetrator as tall and wearing a red jacket, while another insists the person was of average height in a blue shirt. A third remembers a weapon that no one else mentions, while a fourth cannot recall any distinguishing features at all. This phenomenon is not a matter of carelessness or intentional deception, but rather reflects something far more unsettling about how human memory actually functions. Our brains do not record experiences like video cameras capturing objective data. Instead, memory is a reconstructive process, meaning we do not retrieve stored memories intact, but rather rebuild them each time we recall them, and this rebuilding process is susceptible to contamination and distortion at nearly every stage. When we witness an event, our attention is selective and limited, shaped by our expectations, biases, and emotional state in that moment. The brain fills in gaps with assumptions and inferences, constructing a narrative that feels complete and coherent even though significant portions were never actually perceived. After the event, our memories become malleable through exposure to new information, suggestions from other people, repeated questioning, and the power of our own imagination. A police officer's leading question, a news report describing the suspect, or even a casual conversation with another witness can subtly alter what we remember, and these changes feel like genuine memories rather than contaminations. The confidence people express in their eyewitness accounts bears no reliable correlation to the accuracy of those accounts, yet juries and legal systems have historically placed tremendous weight on eyewitness testimony. Innocent people have spent decades in prison based on eyewitness identifications that felt absolutely certain to the witnesses who provided them. Yet DNA evidence later proved those identifications catastrophically wrong. We continue to trust eyewitness testimony despite mounting scientific evidence of its fundamental unreliability, perhaps because the subjective experience of remembering feels so real and vivid that we cannot bring ourselves to doubt it. This disconnect between the feeling of certainty and the reality of error reveals a fundamental vulnerability in human cognition. We are far better at constructing convincing narratives than at accurately perceiving the world, and our legal systems have only recently begun to implement safeguards, such as double-blind lineups and the recording of interrogations, to protect against the predictable ways our memories betray us. Yet even with these procedural improvements, the fundamental challenge remains. We cannot simply train ourselves out of this cognitive limitation, because the mechanisms of memory distortion operate largely outside conscious awareness, making eyewitness unreliability not a problem we can solve through individual effort alone, but rather a systemic vulnerability that demands we restructure how we evaluate evidence itself. This recognition has prompted some jurisdictions to deprioritize eyewitness testimony in favor of forensic evidence and corroborating witnesses. Yet many legal systems still allow a single confident eyewitness to convict a defendant, perpetuating a system that treats subjective certainty as a reliable indicator of objective truth. The irony is particularly stark when we consider that eyewitness testimony often carries more persuasive weight in courtrooms than physical evidence, despite decades of research demonstrating the opposite correlation with. Imagine waking up after surgery to discover that your leg has been amputated, and yet you can still feel it there, still sense its presence in space, still perceive sensations originating from a body part that no longer exists in any physical form, and most disturbingly, you experience intense and often excruciating pain radiating from this limb that exists only in your mind. This phenomenon, known as phantom limb pain, affects up to 80% of amputees in the immediate aftermath of their amputation. And for many individuals, this persistent sensation continues for years or even decades after the physical loss of the limb. The pain itself is not imaginary in the psychological sense that it can be dismissed or overcome through willpower alone, but rather it represents a genuine neurological experience where the brain continues to process and generate pain signals from neural pathways that previously served the missing appendage. The mechanism underlying this phenomenon involves what neuroscientists call the cortical homunculus, which is the brain's internal map of the body where each region is allocated a proportionate amount of neural territory based on sensitivity and importance. And when a limb is removed, the brain does not immediately update this map or reallocate the neural real estate that once corresponded to that missing body part. Instead, the neurons in the primary somatosensory cortex that previously received signals from the amputated limb become hyperactive and reorganized, sometimes receiving input from adjacent body regions. Yet the brain interprets these signals as coming from the phantom limb itself, generating not merely the sensation of its presence, but also the sensation of pain, cramping, burning, or itching that can be as vivid and distressing as any pain experienced from an intact body part. What makes this phenomenon particularly unsettling is that despite our modern understanding of neurology, and despite the fact that individuals fully comprehend that the limb is gone and cannot physically hurt, the brain continues its deception with absolute conviction, creating a convincing illusion that persists regardless of logic or conscious awareness. Reminding us that our perception of reality is not a direct reflection of the world around us, but rather a constructed experience generated entirely within the confines of our nervous system, and that sometimes our minds can trap us in sensations that have no basis in physical reality, yet feel utterly authentic and undeniably present. Some amputees report that their phantom limbs are frozen in the position they occupied at the moment of amputation, while others describe their phantom limbs as gradually shifting into more comfortable positions over time, as if their brains are slowly rewriting the narrative of loss into something more bearable. Yet even this adaptation offers little comfort when the phantom limb is seized by waves of excruciating pain that no medication can fully suppress. Treatment approaches remain frustratingly limited, ranging from mirror therapy, where amputees watch the reflection of their intact limb move in ways that can sometimes trick the brain into updating its body map, to pharmaceutical interventions, virtual reality simulations, and even experimental therapies like spinal cord stimulation. Yet none of these methods provide complete relief for all patients, leaving many to endure their phantom sensations as an inescapable reminder that the body we believe we inhabit exists primarily as an electrochemical narrative that our brains have authored, a narrative that can persist stubbornly even when the physical evidence of that body has been irrevocably removed. Consider a person who has applied for countless jobs over months or years, each application met with silence or rejection, until eventually they stop applying altogether, convinced that no effort on their part will ever result in employment. And so they remain unemployed not because opportunities have truly vanished, but because their mind has internalized the belief that their actions cannot influence their circumstances. This psychological state is called learned helplessness, and it emerges when an individual experiences repeated failure or lack of control over their environment, leading them to develop a pervasive sense that their efforts are futile and that nothing they do will change their situation. The mechanism operates through a subtle rewiring of expectations and motivation. When we repeatedly attempt something and consistently fail, our brain begins to predict that future attempts will also fail, and this prediction becomes so powerful that it suppresses our desire to try at all, even when the conditions that caused the original failures have changed. Laboratory studies have demonstrated this phenomenon with striking clarity, showing that animals subjected to inescapable negative stimuli eventually cease attempting to escape even when escape becomes possible, as if their nervous system has encoded the lesson that resistance is pointless. What makes learned helplessness so deeply unsettling is that it persists illogically, stubbornly refusing to update even when evidence clearly contradicts the initial belief. And we see this in depression, chronic poverty, abusive relationships, and workplace burnout, where individuals continue to believe they have no agency long after the original circumstances that created that belief have shifted or could shift with different effort. The mind, having once learned to be helpless, clings to that lesson with remarkable tenacity, even as opportunity passes silently by, and we have somehow normalized this psychological trap as simply being realistic or accepting one's fate, when in truth it represents one of the most profound failures of the human mind to update its model of the world based on new information. The tragedy is that learned helplessness is not a permanent condition of the mind, but rather a habit of thought that can be interrupted through small, deliberate experiences of agency. Yet we rarely intervene at this level, instead waiting until someone has sunk so deep into the pattern that they can no longer imagine themselves climbing out, at which point we blame them for not trying harder, never recognizing that we are blaming them for a learned response to our world's repeated failures to respond to their effort. The cruel irony is that the person who has learned helplessness often possesses exactly the agency needed to break free, but that agency lies dormant, invisible beneath layers of defeated expectation, waiting for someone or something to convince them that their effort might matter again, and sometimes a single success, one genuine experience of control regained, is enough to begin dismantling the entire structure of learned defeat. Yet we remain curiously reluctant to provide those first small victories, to design systems, workplaces, and communities where people can reliably experience that their efforts produce results. And instead we construct environments of bureaucratic opacity and arbitrary gatekeeping where even genuine effort goes unacknowledged, essentially teaching learned helplessness at scale while wondering why motivation and civic participation continue their steady decline. Consider the psychological phenomenon known as Stockholm Syndrome, a condition so deeply counterintuitive that it seems to violate every principle of rational self-preservation and emotional health. Yet it emerges with remarkable consistency in situations where individuals find themselves trapped in prolonged captivity or abuse at the hands of their captors. The condition derives its name from a 1973 bank robbery in Stockholm, Sweden, where hostages develop positive feelings toward the criminals holding them, even defending them after their release and expressing concern for their welfare. A response so unexpected that psychiatrists struggled to understand how human psychology could so dramatically invert the natural instinct of fear and resistance into something resembling affection and loyalty. The mechanism behind this phenomenon operates through a devastating combination of psychological factors that gradually reshape how a captive person perceives reality and interprets their own survival, beginning with the constant presence of threat and danger that creates an environment where every small act of mercy or minimal kindness from the captor is magnified in the victim's mind to represent profound generosity and care, transforming ordinary human decency into something that seems extraordinary and worthy of gratitude. When a person is isolated, powerless, and dependent entirely upon another individual for their basic needs and their very survival, the human mind adapts by seeking patterns of hope and positive connection, essentially reframing the relationship through a lens that emphasizes any moment of relative safety or compassion, no matter how small or calculated it might actually be. The victim's brain gradually begins to identify with their captor's perspective, adopting their values and justifying their actions, partly because this cognitive shift represents the only way to reduce the unbearable psychological dissonance between the person holding power over them and the desperate need to believe that survival is possible, and that the relationship contains at least some element of genuine care. What renders this phenomenon so deeply unsettling is how it persists even after rescue and freedom, how victims continue to defend their captors and express reluctance to testify against them, demonstrating that the psychological bonds forged under duress operate according to an entirely different logic than ordinary relationships, one where trauma and dependence become inextricably intertwined with attachment and emotional survival. This psychological mechanism illuminates why abusive relationships outside of captivity situations often display similar patterns, partners remaining with abusers, defending their behavior to friends and family, interpreting cycles of violence and reconciliation as evidence of passionate love, revealing that Stockholm Syndrome is less a rare psychiatric curiosity and more a fundamental vulnerability in how human attachment systems respond to intermittent reinforcement, isolation, and power imbalances, a recognition that transforms our understanding of why leaving such situations proves psychologically far more complex than simply walking away from danger. The tragedy deepens when we recognize that the very survival mechanisms that once protected someone from psychological collapse in captivity can become a prison of their own making long after physical escape, as the brain that learned to bond with danger for survival must painfully relearn that safety does not require loyalty, and that freedom means having permission to feel anger, betrayal, and grief for the person they were forced to become. Throughout history, there have been documented cases where groups of people, sometimes numbering in the dozens or even hundreds, suddenly developed the same physical symptoms with no identifiable medical cause, a phenomenon known as mass psychogenic illness or collective hysteria. One of the most famous examples occurred in 1962 in Tanganyika, where a laugh epidemic began with a single schoolgirl and spread to nearly 200 students and adults within weeks, causing uncontrollable laughter, crying, and emotional outbursts that rendered people temporarily unable to function in their daily lives. Another striking case involved a factory in Malaysia where workers began experiencing sudden paralysis and sensory loss, with the symptoms spreading throughout the workforce despite extensive medical investigations revealing absolutely nothing physically wrong with any of them. The mechanism behind these occurrences appears to operate through a combination of psychological suggestion, social reinforcement, and the power of expectation within a shared environment or community. When one person develops symptoms or reports an illness, particularly in a stressful or anxiety-laden setting, those around them become hyper-aware of their own bodily sensations and begin interpreting normal aches, fatigue, or emotional distress as evidence of the same condition, creating a feedback loop where observation and worry intensify the manifestation of symptoms. The brain possesses a remarkable capacity to generate genuine physical sensations based purely on belief and psychological state, a mechanism that operates largely outside conscious awareness and control. What makes mass psychogenic illness particularly fascinating from a neurological perspective is that the symptoms are not fabricated or consciously performed, but rather genuinely experienced by those affected, demonstrating the extraordinary power of the mind to create real physiological responses. These events persist and continue to occur in modern times despite our advanced medical understanding and skepticism toward such phenomena, suggesting that certain deeply rooted psychological vulnerabilities and social dynamics remain fundamentally unchanged, and that the boundary between mental and physical illness is far more permeable than our rational minds would like to believe. The phenomenon reminds us that human beings are not isolated biological entities, but deeply interconnected social creatures whose nervous systems remain exquisitely sensitive to the emotional states and experiences of those around them, a vulnerability that modern medicine and neuroscience are only beginning to fully appreciate and understand. In recent years, cases have emerged in schools and workplaces where clusters of students or employees report symptoms like tremors, dizziness, or sensory disturbances that spread through social media and group communication, suggesting that even in our hyperconnected digital age, the contagion of collective anxiety remains as powerful as ever. This underscores a humbling truth. Despite our scientific sophistication, we remain fundamentally vulnerable to the invisible architecture of suggestion and social influence that shapes how our bodies experience and express distress. Understanding mass psychogenic illness thus becomes essential not merely as a medical curiosity, but as a window into the hidden mechanisms by which our social nature and psychological vulnerabilities intersect, revealing that sometimes the most compelling illnesses are those that originate not from invading pathogens or cellular dysfunction, but from the intricate dance between individual perception and collective consciousness. Imagine a psychiatric condition so strange that it exists not within a single mind, but between two people, a shared delusion that spreads from one person to another like an invisible contagion, and this phenomenon is called folie à deux, which is French for the madness of two. In documented cases throughout psychiatric history, One person suffering from a delusional disorder, often someone with significant influence or proximity to another individual, begins to transmit their false beliefs with such conviction and repetition that the second person gradually abandons their own grasp on reality and adopts these delusions as their own, creating a two-person psychotic episode where both individuals reinforce each other's distorted perceptions of the world. The mechanism behind this phenomenon operates through a combination of psychological vulnerability, emotional dependence, and the fundamental human tendency to trust those closest to us. Because when we spend extended periods with another person, especially in isolation or in relationships where one person holds significant psychological power over the other, our ability to distinguish between their reality and our own becomes increasingly compromised. And through repeated exposure to their beliefs, through the emotional intensity with which they present these ideas, and through our own desire to maintain harmony in the relationship, we gradually begin to accept their version of reality as valid. What makes Folie à Deux particularly unsettling is how it reveals the fragility of our individual grip on objective truth, and how easily our sense of reality can be hijacked by social influence. Because we like to believe that we are independent thinkers capable of maintaining our own mental boundaries. Yet this condition demonstrates that under the right circumstances of psychological pressure and emotional vulnerability, even rational people can lose the ability to distinguish between genuine threats and imaginary ones, between reasonable concerns and paranoid delusions. And remarkably, when the two individuals are separated, the secondary person often recovers relatively quickly as their individual sense of reality reasserts itself, leaving us with the sobering realization that our sanity may be more dependent on our relationships and social environment than we dare to admit. This raises profound questions about the nature of mental health itself. If sanity is partly a social construction maintained through our relationships, then perhaps what we call individual mental illness is sometimes better understood as a breakdown in the delicate social structures that keep us tethered to a shared reality. And conversely, recovery may depend less on individual treatment than on restoring healthy relationships that reflect objective truth back to us. This insight transforms how we might understand not just clinical folie à deux, but also the dynamics of cults, abusive relationships, and even political movements, where shared false beliefs create psychological bonds that feel as real and protective as they are destructive, reminding us that the line between collective delusion and collective sanity is often thinner than we imagine. And perhaps most troublingly, in our modern age of algorithmic echo chambers and social media filter bubbles, we may all be participating in a kind of mass folie à deux, where shared false beliefs spread through networks of millions, each person reinforcing the delusions of countless others, creating psychological feedback loops so powerful that separating individuals from the collective delusion becomes nearly impossible. Imagine waking up in a city you do not recognize, wearing clothes you do not remember putting on, with no memory of how you arrived at this place or what has happened to you in the past hours or even days. And this is the lived reality of individuals experiencing dissociative fugue states, a rare but profoundly unsettling condition in which a person essentially loses their sense of identity and personal history while simultaneously maintaining the ability to function, speak coherently, and navigate the world as if nothing is wrong. During these episodes, which can last anywhere from mere hours to several years in the most extreme cases, the afflicted individual may travel long distances, assume new identities, establish new relationships, hold down employment, and create entirely fabricated personal histories, all while their true self remains completely absent from conscious awareness, locked away behind an impenetrable psychological barrier that their mind has constructed for protection. The mechanism underlying this phenomenon appears to be a catastrophic failure in the brain's ability to maintain continuity of consciousness and autobiographical memory, typically triggered by severe psychological trauma, extreme stress, or in some cases, head injury or neurological disease. And when the mind encounters trauma so overwhelming that the normal pathways of memory consolidation and identity integration become compromised, it may resort to this ultimate defense mechanism of essentially erasing the threatening parts of the self entirely. What makes dissociative fugue particularly disturbing is that the person experiencing it seems fundamentally unchanged to outside observers. They maintain speech, motor function, and the capacity for complex social interaction, yet the core essence of who they are has simply vanished from their own internal experience. And when recovery finally occurs, often spontaneously and without explanation, the individual regains their original identity, but typically has no recollection whatsoever of the intervening period, creating a permanent void in their personal timeline that cannot be recovered or reconstructed. The persistence of this condition throughout human history, despite our modern understanding of neurology and psychology, suggests that the human mind possesses capabilities for self-protection that far exceed our current ability to predict or prevent. And the fact that complete personality alteration and amnesia can occur in a fully functioning adult who appears perfectly normal to casual observation reveals a fragility in our sense of continuous selfhood that most people remain blissfully unaware exists within their own consciousness. In documented cases, individuals have been found wandering with completely fabricated backgrounds, possessing skills they never learned, and speaking with unfamiliar accents, only to awaken one day with their original memories intact and no explanation for the months or years that transpired, suggesting that within the fractured mind lies not merely a gap, but an entirely parallel existence capable of sustaining itself independently from conscious awareness. This phenomenon ultimately confronts us with the unsettling possibility that identity itself is far more tenuous and contingent than we typically assume, and that the unified self we experience as our baseline reality may be less a fundamental feature of consciousness, and more a carefully maintained construction that our minds can abandon entirely when the psychological cost of maintaining it becomes unbearable. The implications are profound. If the mind can so completely rewrite itself to escape suffering, then perhaps what we call the self is not a fixed entity, but rather a narrative that consciousness tells itself. Consider for a moment the unsettling possibility that the world you perceive right now is not actually the world as it exists, but rather a carefully constructed simulation generated entirely by your brain based on incomplete sensory information filtered through your expectations, beliefs, and past experiences. Your brain does not passively receive reality like a camera recording footage. Instead, it actively constructs your conscious experience by taking fragmented data from your senses and filling in the gaps with predictions and assumptions, meaning that what you experience as a seamless, objective reality is actually a highly personalized hallucination that your brain has learned to agree with through evolutionary refinement. When you look at a red apple, for instance, you're not actually seeing the apple itself, but rather a neural representation of light wavelengths that your brain has interpreted, colored, and placed in three-dimensional space according to its internal models. And if your expectations about what an apple should look like changed, your actual perception of that same apple would fundamentally change as well. This process extends far beyond simple visual perception into emotion, memory, and social interaction, where your brain constructs narratives about your own life, rewriting memories unconsciously to fit your current self-image, creating false details that feel entirely authentic, and generating meanings and connections between events that may never have actually been connected. The mechanism behind this phenomenon lies in the brain's predictive processing model, wherein the brain constantly generates predictions about what it expects to encounter in the world, and then uses actual sensory input primarily to correct these predictions rather than to build them from scratch, which means your perception is always a few hundred milliseconds behind reality, and what you think you are experiencing in the present moment is actually your brain's best guess about what is happening. What makes this particularly disturbing is how thoroughly we have normalized this process despite its profound implications for our understanding of truth, objectivity, and shared reality. Continuing to act as though our perceptions give us direct access to an objective world when neuroscience has definitively demonstrated that perception is fundamentally constructed, selective, and deeply subjective. We move through our days treating our individual reality constructions as though they are universal facts, arguing with others whose brains have constructed different realities from the same sensory data, and rarely confronting the philosophical vertigo that comes from understanding that consciousness itself might be nothing more than an elaborate internal simulation that happens to keep us alive through its practical accuracy rather than its truth. Yet paradoxically, this realization need not lead to solipsistic despair. Instead, it offers liberation in understanding that the reality we construct is not fixed but malleable, that by becoming aware of our brain's predictive mechanisms, we gain some capacity to consciously question and even reshape the simulations we inhabit, suggesting that the boundary between objective truth and subjective experience may be less a wall and more a permeable membrane we continuously negotiate through attention, intention, and the stories we choose to believe about ourselves and our world. This means that understanding how your brain constructs reality is not merely an intellectual exercise. It is a practical tool for recognizing where your perceptions may be limited or distorted, and for deliberately cultivating new perceptions that might serve you and others more compassionately and truthfully than the habitual simula. Consider a moment when you believe you have made a deliberate choice, perhaps deciding to reach for your coffee cup, to change the channel on your television, or to speak a particular word in conversation. You experience this moment as conscious intention followed by action, a seamless flow where your aware mind directs your body according to your will. However, neuroscientific research using functional magnetic resonance imaging has consistently demonstrated that your brain initiates the motor preparation for these actions several seconds before you become consciously aware that you have made a decision at all. This temporal gap, sometimes referred to as the readiness potential, suggests that your unconscious mind has already committed to an action while your conscious mind is still processing information, only to arrive afterward and claim authorship of a decision that was already underway. When researchers present subjects with visual stimuli and ask them to perform voluntary actions while their brain activity is simultaneously monitored, the neural signatures of decision-making appear in regions associated with unconscious processing long before the subjects report any conscious intention or awareness. This means that the feeling of deliberate choice, that sense of consciously deciding and then acting, may be largely an illusion constructed after the fact, a narrative your conscious mind creates to maintain the experience of being in control. The truly unsettling dimension of this phenomenon lies in how thoroughly we accept this illusion despite knowing it occurs, how we continue to experience ourselves as the autonomous decision-makers of our actions when the evidence suggests our conscious minds are more like passengers observing events that were planned before we knew they were coming. We live with this knowledge without truly integrating it, maintaining two contradictory beliefs simultaneously, and somehow this cognitive dissonance causes us no particular distress, as though we have already decided, unconsciously, not to let this fact disturb us. Perhaps this acceptance itself is the final evidence of the phenomenon's truth, that we remain untroubled by our lack of agency, because the unconscious mechanisms that govern our beliefs have already determined we should accept this comfortable fiction, leaving our conscious minds free to feel the satisfying illusion of understanding while remaining fundamentally blind to the machinery that moves us. You experience this blind spot most vividly in moments of genuine moral conviction, when you feel certain you chose to act ethically, to help a stranger, to refuse a temptation. Yet the decision was likely already made by neural processes shaped by your genetics, upbringing, and environment long before your conscious self arrived to take the bow. In this way, the illusion of conscious choice may be not merely a curiosity of neuroscience, but the foundation upon which we construct meaning, responsibility, and identity, even as that foundation silently shifts beneath us. Yet we persist in holding ourselves and others accountable as though this foundation were solid, as though the person who acted was truly the author of their actions rather than merely the narrator. And in this persistence, in this refusal to fully accept the implications of what neuroscience reveals, we may find not delusion but a necessary fiction, one so essential to how we organize society, distribute blame and praise, and maintain our bonds with one another that perhaps no amount of evidence could truly displace it. And yet this necessary fiction becomes dangerous when we forget it is one, when we design punishment systems on the assumption of perfect conscious control, or when we blame ourselves with the cruelty of those. Your mind does not simply retrieve memories like a computer pulling files from a hard drive. Instead, it reconstructs them each time you recall an event, and in that reconstruction process, your brain fills in gaps with details that feel entirely real but never actually happened, a phenomenon known as confabulation, where false memories are created without any intention to deceive and often with complete confidence in their accuracy. Imagine a person who witnessed a car accident years ago, and when asked to describe it now, they recall vivid details of the other driver's clothing, the exact words spoken at the scene, and even the weather conditions with such clarity that they would stake their life on these details. Yet when confronted with evidence like photographs or witness statements, they discover that nearly half of what they remember is completely fabricated. The psychological mechanism behind confabulation involves the brain's desperate need to create coherent narratives from fragmented sensory experiences and stored information. When your memory has holes in it, your mind does not simply admit defeat and say, "I do not know." But instead it unconsciously generates plausible details based on your expectations, beliefs, and what you think should have happened rather than what actually did. This process is not a moral failing or a sign of dishonesty, because the person experiencing confabulation genuinely believes they are recounting accurate memories, and their confidence in these false details is completely sincere, making confabulation particularly insidious because it operates entirely beneath conscious awareness. The phenomenon becomes even more troubling when we consider how it affects eyewitness testimony in criminal cases, where people swear under oath that they saw a suspect's face clearly, yet DNA evidence later proves they identified the wrong person entirely, or how recovered memory therapy in the 1980s led people to confidently remember childhood abuse that investigation suggested never occurred. Despite decades of research proving that human memory is fundamentally unreliable, and that false memories can be implanted through suggestion and repetition, we continue to trust our recollections with the same absolute certainty as our ancestors did thousands of years ago, building our legal systems, relationships, and personal identities on the foundation of memories that our brains have quite literally invented. And we accept this normalized dysfunction so completely that we rarely stop to consider how profoundly strange it is that the very mechanism we use to know ourselves and understand our past is constantly rewriting its own story. The tragedy is that we have no reliable way to distinguish between a genuine memory and a confabulated one from the inside. The feeling of certainty is identical, which means that even as you read this and recognize confabulation as a real phenomenon, you are simultaneously trusting countless memories that your brain has reconstructed and partially invented, unable to know which ones are real and which ones are elaborate fictions your mind has constructed so convincingly that they have become indistinguishable from truth. This means that the person who confidently recalls their childhood home's blue front door may have unconsciously borrowed that detail from a photograph seen years later, and the friend who swears they warned you about a decision you made might genuinely remember giving that advice, even though they learned about the outcome first, and their brains simply rewrote the timeline to make the narrative coherent. Consider the peculiar vulnerability of the human mind when placed in a state of focused relaxation, a condition where your critical faculties seem to soften and your ordinary resistance to influence diminishes in ways that feel almost involuntary. Hypnotic suggestibility describes this documented phenomenon where individuals in a hypnotic trance become remarkably receptive to ideas, commands, and false memories that they would ordinarily reject or scrutinize with skepticism. And research has consistently shown that roughly 80 to 90% of people possess at least some degree of susceptibility to hypnotic induction, though the depth of this susceptibility varies considerably from person to person. When a person enters a hypnotic state, their brain exhibits measurable changes in neural activity, particularly in regions associated with executive function and self-monitoring. And during this altered state, the suggestions offered by a hypnotist seem to bypass the normal analytical processes that would typically filter incoming information and evaluate its validity against existing beliefs and knowledge. What makes this phenomenon genuinely unsettling is that individuals under hypnosis do not lose consciousness or awareness, but rather experience a selective narrowing of attention where the hypnotist's voice becomes disproportionately dominant and persuasive, causing the person to respond to suggestions with an automaticity that feels divorced from their conscious decision-making. The mechanism underlying this susceptibility appears to involve a specific quality of focused attention combined with a temporary reduction in the brain's default mode network activity, which normally maintains our sense of self-awareness and critical judgment. And this combination creates a window where new information and suggestions can be incorporated into cognition with minimal resistance or verification. Perhaps most disturbing is the realization that this vulnerability persists despite our intellectual understanding that it exists. And despite knowing that hypnotic suggestion can be powerful, most people still underestimate the degree to which their own minds might be susceptible to influence when placed in this particular state of relaxed yet focused attention, suggesting that awareness alone provides remarkably little protection against this deeply embedded aspect of human neurobiology. This gap between intellectual knowledge and experiential vulnerability becomes even more apparent when we consider cases where individuals have been induced under hypnosis to perform actions they consciously find morally repugnant, or to develop physical symptoms like temporary paralysis or blindness, demonstrating that the hypnotic state can override not merely our skepticism, but even our deeply held values and the integrity of our bodily control. The unsettling implication is that hypnotic suggestibility reveals a fundamental architecture of the human mind, one where conscious belief and rational understanding occupy a surprisingly thin layer above deeper neurological processes that can be directly accessed and manipulated through the right combination of relaxation, focused attention, and authoritative suggestion. And this discovery becomes particularly consequential when we recognize that hypnotic techniques, or approximations of them, are embedded throughout everyday persuasion, from the rhythmic cadence of advertising jingles to the mesmerizing scroll of social media feeds, suggesting that understanding our vulnerability to hypnotic suggestion is not merely academic curiosity, but essential literacy for navigating a world designed to exploit precisely these neurological susceptibilities. In the late 1990s, a neuroscientist named Michael Persinger constructed what he called the God helmet, a modified motorcycle helmet fitted with electromagnetic coils positioned over specific regions of the brain, particularly the temporal lobes, which are known to be associated with spiritual experiences, memory, and emotional processing. When Persinger activated these coils to generate weak electromagnetic fields, the vast majority of subjects who wore the helmet reported profound and deeply moving experiences that they described in almost exclusively spiritual or religious language, claiming to sense an overwhelming presence in the room with them, to feel the touch of an invisible entity, or to experience what they characterized as direct contact with something divine or transcendent. What makes this research so profoundly unsettling is not merely that Persinger could artificially generate these experiences through electromagnetic stimulation, but rather what it suggests about the nature of religious and spiritual revelation throughout human history and the possibility that countless mystical visions, prophetic moments, and divine encounters that have shaped civilizations and inspired billions of people might ultimately be nothing more than the result of unusual electromagnetic activity in the temporal lobes of the human brain. The mechanism appears to involve the way that electromagnetic stimulation can disrupt normal neural communication in the temporal regions, creating a neurological condition where the brain essentially generates a coherent entity model, a sensation of presence that feels undeniably real and external to the self, yet originates entirely from within the mind's own processing of its sensory confusion. Yet despite decades of research into these findings, despite the growing understanding that spiritual experiences can be reliably produced through electromagnetic stimulation, religion and spirituality have not fundamentally changed or diminished in the modern world, and people continue to interpret these experiences as genuine encounters with the divine rather than as neurological phenomena that can be switched on and off like a light. We have somehow compartmentalized this knowledge, accepting that yes, the brain can generate such sensations, while simultaneously maintaining the conviction that our own experiences were somehow different, more authentic, more genuinely connected to ultimate reality than those of experimental subjects in a laboratory wearing a modified helmet. Perhaps this reflects something fundamental about human consciousness itself, that the subjective certainty of an experience, its emotional intensity and sense of absolute reality, may be entirely independent of its ultimate origin, leaving us forever unable to definitively distinguish between a divine encounter and an electromagnetic fluctuation, between revelation and neural artifact. And perhaps this ambiguity is not a failure of science or spirituality, but rather an indication that the distinction itself may be false, that the divine, if it exists, might work through the very mechanisms of our neurology rather than despite them, leaving us in the peculiar position of having mapped the territory of transcendence without resolving whether the map reveals the territory's true nature or merely the nature of the mapmaker's mind. In this way, Persinger's God helmet becomes less a refutation of spirituality and more a mirror held up to the fundamental mystery of consciousness itself, a device that forces us to confront the possibility that the question, "Is this experience real?" may be less important than understanding what it means for an experience to feel absolutely, undeniably real to the person experiencing it. Throughout history and across virtually every culture on Earth, people have reported encountering spiritual presences, divine beings, and paranormal entities that seem to manifest most vividly during moments of extreme stress, illness, or altered consciousness. And what remains remarkably consistent across these accounts is that the witnesses describe feeling a profound presence in the room with them, often perceiving a shadowy figure or sensing an intelligence observing them from just beyond their normal field of vision. Modern neuroscience has discovered that these experiences, which once would have been attributed entirely to supernatural forces or demonic possession, may actually originate from a specific region of the brain called the temporal lobe, which sits near the ear and plays a crucial role in processing sensory information, emotion, and the construction of our sense of self. When the temporal lobe becomes stimulated abnormally through epileptic seizures, temporal lobe epilepsy, extreme fever, or even through electromagnetic stimulation applied in laboratory settings, patients consistently report the same catalog of experiences. The sensation of a malevolent presence in the room, the feeling of being watched or touched by something invisible, a profound sense of dread or transcendence, and sometimes even the perception of a fully formed entity standing nearby. Researchers have deliberately stimulated specific points within the temporal lobe during brain surgery while patients remained conscious, and these patients spontaneously reported feeling as though someone else was in the operating room with them, or that they themselves were somehow doubled, or that their consciousness had split into multiple entities. The mechanism appears to involve the temporal lobe's role in integrating sensory information with our sense of personal identity and ownership of our body. And when this integration misfires, the brain essentially creates a phantom presence or generates the sensation that some other consciousness inhabits the space around us. What makes this phenomenon particularly unsettling is that despite our scientific understanding of its neurological basis, the experiences feel absolutely real and often profoundly transformative to those who encounter them. And many people who have experienced these temporal lobe phenomena maintain their conviction that they encountered something genuinely supernatural, suggesting that knowledge of the mechanism does little to diminish the subjective intensity or the person's interpretation of what occurred. Some neuroscientists speculate that throughout human history, individuals predisposed to temporal lobe stimulation may have become shamans, mystics, or religious leaders, their neurologically generated visions interpreted as genuine communion with the divine and lending credibility to their spiritual authority within their communities. This raises a profound question, whether the boundary between neurology and spirituality is truly as clear as modern science assumes, or whether these two frameworks might be describing the same fundamental human experience through different languages. Perhaps the most humbling possibility is that spiritual experiences need not be either purely neurological or purely supernatural, that the temporal lobe, far from debunking the sacred, may simply be the biological instrument through which human consciousness encounters dimensions of reality that materialism alone cannot fully explain. And indeed, the accounts of Paul's conversion on the Damascus Road, Joan of Arc's commanding voices, and the visionary experiences of countless mystics across traditions may have been not fabrications or delusions, but genuine encounters filtered through the unique neurological architect. When people survive life-threatening experiences, they often report memories of events that never actually occurred, a phenomenon so consistent that researchers have developed specific terminology to describe it. Yet the human mind seems entirely unaware of its own deception in these moments. A person who nearly drowns might vividly recall being pulled from the water by a mysterious figure, or someone who loses consciousness during surgery might describe in perfect detail conversations between doctors and nurses that took place while they were completely anesthetized and unable to perceive anything whatsoever. The brain, faced with a gap in consciousness or a traumatic experience it cannot fully process, does not simply leave the space blank. Instead, it manufactures sensory experiences, emotions, and narrative sequences that feel absolutely genuine to the person remembering them, complete with textures, colors, sounds, and the kind of specific details that typically accompany authentic memories. This occurs because the mind prioritizes continuity and coherence above accuracy, treating a period of unconsciousness as an unacceptable narrative interruption that must be filled in with plausible content. The brain draws upon expectations, cultural stories about what near-death experiences should entail, fragments of sensory input that did register before consciousness faded, and the emotional tenor of the situation to construct false memories that feel more real than genuine recollection. What makes this particularly unsettling is that these fabrications persist even when people learn they could not possibly be true, even when medical records contradict their accounts, even when the physical layout of the room they described differs entirely from reality. The human mind appears to commit to these false narratives with such conviction that questioning them feels like questioning sanity itself, yet the memories remain ironically untouched by evidence, standing as testament to how thoroughly our sense of having experienced something can be divorced from whether we actually experienced it. This disconnect between subjective certainty and objective fact reveals something profound about consciousness itself. The feeling of remembering is not a reliable indicator of what actually happened, and the vivid intensity with which we experience a memory bears no necessary relationship to its truth, suggesting that our sense of self is constructed from narratives we cannot fully trust. Yet perhaps most troublingly, these fabricated memories often become more psychologically real to survivors than the actual event itself, shaping how they understand their survival, what meaning they assign to it, and fundamentally altering the narrative of their own lives based on experiences their brains entirely invented. In this sense, near-death fabrications are not merely false memories, they are the architects of identity, constructing who we believe ourselves to be from material that never existed outside the theater of our own consciousness. A person who survives cardiac arrest might construct an entire spiritual framework around a tunnel of light that never physically entered their eyes, organizing subsequent decades around the meaning of an experience that existed only in the electrochemical misfiring of a dying brain. Yet this invented memory becomes more influential in shaping their choices, relationships, and sense of purpose than any verifiable fact about what actually occurred during those critical minutes. The irony is that we cannot easily dismiss these false narratives as merely psychological artifacts. They become the substrate upon which meaning itself is constructed, suggesting that the distinction between invented and authentic experience may be less foo. Consider the psychological phenomenon known as ego death, a state in which the sense of self temporarily dissolves and the boundaries between the individual and the external world blur into a singular unified experience. A condition that has been documented through meditation practices, psychedelic experiences, and certain neurological events. And observe how this state produces in many people an existential terror so profound that they would go to great lengths to avoid it despite the fact that ego death itself is fundamentally harmless and causes no physical damage whatsoever. The mechanism behind this fear appears to operate at the deepest levels of consciousness, where the mind has constructed an identity that it perceives as the core of existence. And when that identity structure begins to dissolve, the psyche interprets this dissolution not as a temporary neurological event, but as genuine annihilation, as the literal ending of the self. Triggering every protective instinct the organism possesses, even though the person will inevitably return to their normal state of consciousness, with their personality and memories entirely intact. The terror seems to arise from the mind's inability to conceive of non-existence while conscious, creating a paradoxical fear of something that is neither death nor harm, but merely an alteration in perception, a brief dissolution of the artificial boundaries we construct around our sense of self. What remains remarkable is that despite the fact that countless individuals have experienced ego death and returned unharmed, despite scientific research showing that this state carries no inherent danger, and despite the logical understanding that one's identity will return intact, the fear persists in those who have never encountered it, suggesting that our minds are fundamentally wired to resist the dissolution of the self-structure with an intensity that seems disproportionate to any actual threat. As though we have evolved to guard the ego boundary so jealously that even temporary surrendering of it triggers the deepest survival mechanisms, making ego death terror a haunting reminder that our greatest fears often exist not as responses to genuine danger, but as protective mechanisms designed to preserve a construct that may be far more fragile and contingent than we have ever considered it to be. Yet perhaps the most unsettling aspect of this phenomenon is that the very intensity of our resistance to ego death reveals something crucial about human consciousness. That we are not merely protecting a self, but defending against the possibility that the self we protect so fiercely may have been an illusion all along, and that moment of dissolution offers a glimpse into a truth our waking minds have evolved specifically to deny. This realization, that the self might be fundamentally constructed rather than foundational, transforms ego death from a mere neurological curiosity into a philosophical crisis, explaining why meditation practitioners sometimes abandon their practice in fear, why individuals on psychedelics may fight desperately against the dissolution, even as they intellectually understand its temporary nature. And why the mere contemplation of ego death can trigger anxiety in those who have glimpsed its possibility. For to truly accept ego death is to accept that the fortress of identity we have spent our entire lives building and defending may be nothing more than an elaborate consensual hallucination maintained through constant cognitive effort. And yet this very terror may serve an evolutionary purpose. The ego's fierce resistance to dissolution ensures we maintain the coherent identity necessary to navigate social bonds, plan for the future, and survive in a world that demands a unified self, meaning that our. Imagine standing in a crowded room, surrounded by people you know, yet feeling as though you are watching yourself from outside your own body, observing your movements and words as though they belong to someone else entirely. A strange disconnect where your hands seem to belong to a puppet you are controlling rather than extensions of your own consciousness. And this sensation can persist for hours or even days, creating a deeply unsettling experience where the world appears muted, dreamlike, and somehow unreal despite your complete awareness that nothing has actually changed around you. Depersonalization episodes represent a dissociative state where the brain essentially creates a protective barrier between your conscious awareness and your sense of self, a psychological mechanism that emerges most commonly during periods of extreme stress, anxiety, trauma, or panic, when the mind determines that the present moment has become too overwhelming for your normal processing systems to handle. The brain essentially initiates a kind of emergency shutdown of emotional connection to your immediate experience, allowing you to continue functioning while simultaneously detaching you from the visceral reality of what is happening, which can feel like you are observing your life through thick glass or watching a film of your own existence rather than living it directly. This response likely evolved as a protective mechanism, a way for the human mind to create psychological distance from unbearable situations. Yet what makes depersonalization particularly disturbing is that it often persists long after the initial trigger has passed, continuing even when you are safe and no longer in any genuine danger, creating a self-perpetuating cycle where the fear of the depersonalization itself becomes the very thing that sustains it. The sensation can include visual distortions where familiar places seem foreign, emotional numbness where you cannot feel love or connection to people around you, or a constant sense that you are not truly inhabiting your body. And remarkably, sufferers remain aware throughout that something is wrong, that this is not normal, yet this awareness does nothing to dispel the sensation, which creates an exhausting paradox where your logical mind knows you are safe, while your emotional mind refuses to believe it. What persists most troublingly is how our modern world, filled with constant stimulation, information overload, and chronic low-level anxiety, has made depersonalization increasingly common, normalizing the experience so thoroughly that many people endure months or years of this disconnection without seeking help, assuming it is simply part of their permanent neurological makeup rather than understanding it as a treatable symptom of their mind's response to unsustainable pressure. A haunting reminder that even our most protective mechanisms can become prisons of their own design. The path toward recovery begins not with fighting the sensation itself, but with understanding that depersonalization is fundamentally a message from your nervous system, a signal that your psychological resources have been depleted, and that genuine relief requires addressing the underlying stress, anxiety, or trauma, rather than simply waiting for the disconnection to mysteriously dissolve on its own. This might mean establishing consistent sleep and exercise routines, gradually reducing caffeine and stimulant use, practicing grounding techniques that anchor you to your five senses, or seeking professional support through therapy modalities specifically designed to address dissociation. Recognizing that the very act of acknowledging depersonalization as treatable rather than permanent is often the first step toward reclaiming your sense of embodied PR. Imagine standing in a familiar place, surrounded by people you know and objects you have touched countless times before, yet everything around you feels profoundly unreal, as though you are watching your life through thick glass or observing it on a television screen rather than living it directly. This is the experience of derealization disorder, a condition where the external world becomes persistently dreamlike, distant, and emotionally disconnected despite your intellectual awareness that nothing has actually changed. People with this disorder describe their surroundings as appearing foggy, flat, or pixelated, colors seem muted, sounds feel hollow, and the spatial relationship between themselves and their environment becomes warped and uncertain. A person might look at their own home where they have lived for years and feel startled by its unfamiliarity, or they might watch their loved ones speak without feeling any emotional resonance to their words, as though observing actors performing a scene rather than engaging with genuine human connection. The psychological mechanism underlying derealization appears to be a dissociative response triggered by overwhelming stress, anxiety, trauma, or panic, wherein the brain essentially dampens emotional processing and perceptual intensity as a protective measure, creating a buffer between the conscious mind and potentially threatening information. This numbing of reality serves as an unconscious defense mechanism, protecting the psyche from becoming flooded with unbearable emotional content by literally reducing the perceived intensity of the world itself. Yet what makes derealization particularly unsettling is its paradoxical persistence in modern life, where constant overstimulation, chronic anxiety, social isolation, and information overload have normalized a state of psychological detachment that our ancestors would have found utterly alien and terrifying. We have created environments and lifestyles so inherently stressful that our minds now routinely retreat from full engagement with reality as a coping strategy. And we have begun to accept this dissociative numbness as simply part of the contemporary human experience, rather than recognizing it as a sign that something fundamental in our world has become deeply misaligned with our psychological needs. The tragedy is that we often mistake this disconnection for clarity or emotional maturity, labeling those who experience derealization as thoughtful or philosophical, when in reality they may be suffering from a fragmented relationship with existence itself, a condition that whispers the false comfort of detachment while slowly eroding their ability to feel truly alive, to form genuine bonds, and to find meaning in the texture and immediacy of their own lives. In this state of perpetual unreality, people often find themselves going through the motions of existence, eating meals they cannot taste, attending gatherings where they feel invisible, pursuing goals that seem hollow, all while a quiet voice in their mind asks whether they are truly present in any meaningful way, or whether they have simply become ghosts haunting their own biography. The cruelest irony is that recognizing this disconnection, becoming aware that one is watching rather than living, often intensifies the derealization itself, as the sufferer becomes hypervigilant about their own absence, endlessly monitoring whether reality feels real enough, trapped in a recursive loop where the very attempt to reclaim presence only deepens the sense of separation. And yet within this paradox lies a glimmer of hope. The very awareness that one is dissociated, painful as it is, represents the mind's continued attempt to signal distress, a cry for reconnection that, if heeded with compassion and imagine a patient who has suffered a severe stroke that has completely paralyzed their left side, rendering their arm and leg entirely useless. Yet when you ask them to move their left arm, they insist they just moved it perfectly, or they explain that they are simply choosing not to move it at this moment, or they might suggest that their arm is actually fine, but they are just tired today. This is anosognosia, a neurological condition in which a person suffering from a disability or illness is completely unaware of their condition, and more strikingly, they are not simply in denial in the psychological sense, where they are suppressing awareness of something they unconsciously know. Rather, their brain has genuinely lost the ability to perceive or acknowledge the deficit that exists within their own body or mind. The mechanism behind this phenomenon appears to involve damage to the areas of the brain responsible for self-awareness and interoception, which is the ability to sense the internal state of one's own body, combined with damage to the regions that process and integrate feedback from the body about movement and sensation. When these neural systems are disrupted, the brain cannot receive or process the information that something is wrong, so it does not generate any sense that something is amiss. In some cases, the brain actually confabulates, creating false memories or explanations that seem to justify why the person is not moving their supposedly functional limb. What makes this condition particularly unsettling is that no amount of logical argument, no amount of showing the person their own paralyzed limb, no amount of presenting them with evidence will convince them that anything is wrong, because the fundamental neural machinery that would allow them to perceive and accept this reality has been compromised at its foundation. They are not being stubborn or psychologically resistant. They literally cannot perceive the problem that exists, and this strikes at something deeply disturbing about human consciousness itself. The realization that our awareness of our own bodies and our own conditions depends entirely on the continued proper functioning of specific neural structures, and when those structures fail, we can lose not just our abilities, but our very ability to know that we have lost them. It is a condition that forces us to confront the uncomfortable truth that consciousness is not some unified, all-seeing observer surveying our inner landscape, but rather a fragmented collection of neural processes that can be selectively disrupted, leaving us stranded in a subjective reality that bears no correspondence to objective truth, yet feels completely convincing from the inside. A patient with anosognosia may insist they are a renowned concert pianist even as they sit in a hospital bed unable to move their fingers, or they may deny having suffered a stroke at all while their entire right side lies motionless beside them. Their conviction absolute because the neural damage has not merely hidden the truth from them, but has fundamentally altered what their brain is capable of experiencing as real. This profound disconnection between internal experience and external reality raises a haunting question. If a person with anosognosia cannot access the truth about their condition, in what sense can we say they are suffering from a problem at all? Or are they instead inhabiting a subjective world where, by the only measures available to their damaged brain, everything is exactly as it should be? Perhaps the answer lies in recognizing that suffering itself requires awareness, and in that sense, anosognosia may represent a cruel mercy, a condition where the person is spared the anguish of knowing what they have lost, even as those around them be. Imagine waking up one morning and discovering that the faces of everyone around you have become utterly meaningless, a collection of features that fail to register as distinct or recognizable, leaving you unable to identify your spouse, your children, or even yourself in the mirror, forced instead to rely on voices, clothing, and contextual clues to navigate a world where the most fundamental form of human recognition has simply vanished. This is the lived reality of individuals with prosopagnosia, commonly known as face-blindness, a neurological condition that disrupts the brain's extraordinary ability to process and store facial information, preventing the automatic recognition systems that most people take for granted from functioning at even the most basic level. The condition typically results from damage to specific regions within the brain's temporal and occipital lobes, particularly areas known as the fusiform face area and the superior temporal sulcus, regions that have evolved specifically to handle the complex task of facial recognition with remarkable speed and precision, yet when these areas are compromised or fail to develop properly, they leave individuals stranded in a peculiar form of social blindness, where faces become essentially interchangeable and forgettable. What makes prosopagnosia particularly unsettling is the persistence of this disconnection despite the constant exposure to faces and despite the conscious effort people with the condition make to recognize and remember individuals, suggesting that facial recognition operates through neural pathways so specialized and automatic that conscious will and logical reasoning cannot compensate for their absence. Individuals with prosopagnosia report the profound isolation of being unable to recognize colleagues they have worked with for years, of feeling the acute embarrassment of not knowing whether the person greeting them warmly is a close friend or a complete stranger, of developing elaborate compensatory strategies such as analyzing gait, hairstyle, or the specific way someone stands, yet still living with the constant anxiety that comes from never quite being certain about anyone's identity. The condition reveals how much of human social interaction depends on an unconscious neural process that operates beneath the level of conscious awareness, and how the absence of this single ability can fundamentally alter the texture of human relationships and the sense of connection to the world around us, reminding us that our brains contain specialized systems so fundamental to social functioning that we rarely notice them until they fail. Yet neuroscience has also revealed that some individuals with prosopagnosia possess intact emotional recognition, meaning they can sense that a face before them expresses sadness or joy, even as the identity of that face remains a complete mystery. A poignant reminder that facial recognition and facial emotion processing are distinct neural systems, and that the brain's architecture contains far more compartmentalized specializations than we might intuitively expect. This dissociation between identity recognition and emotional perception has profound implications for understanding consciousness itself, suggesting that the unified experience of knowing another person is actually an intricate tapestry of separate neural systems working in concert, and that the self we experience as whole is genuinely composed of countless specialized subsystems that ordinarily collaborate so seamlessly we mistake their collective output for a single, unified process. Imagine being asked to close your eyes and picture a bright red apple sitting on a wooden table in front of you, and yet when you do, there is absolutely nothing there in your mind's eye, no visual imagery whatsoever, just darkness and an absence of any mental picture. And this is the daily reality for millions of people who experience a condition called aphantasia, a neurological variation where individuals lack the ability to voluntarily create, generate, or manipulate mental images in their consciousness. For most people, visualization feels as natural and automatic as breathing, a fundamental cognitive function so ingrained in human experience that we rarely question it or even acknowledge its existence. But for those with aphantasia, this entire dimension of mental experience simply does not occur, and they navigate a world where memories exist as abstract concepts and facts rather than vivid sensory replays. Where imagination functions through language and logic rather than visual representation, and where the most basic creative exercises that others take for granted become impossible tasks. The mechanism underlying aphantasia appears to involve differences in how the brain's visual cortex and the neural pathways responsible for generating mental imagery are wired or connected, with neuroimaging studies suggesting that the brains of people with aphantasia show reduced activation in areas typically associated with visual imagination, and while the exact neurological basis remains under investigation. Researchers theorize that some individuals may have been born with these neural differences, while others might acquire aphantasia through brain injury or certain medical conditions. What makes this condition particularly fascinating from a psychological perspective is how long it remained largely unknown and unrecognized by mainstream science and society, with people experiencing aphantasia often spending decades believing that something was profoundly wrong with them, feeling isolated and unable to explain to others why they could not participate in visualization exercises, guided meditations, or creative visualization techniques that everyone else seemed to find so effortless and rewarding. The condition persists in a strange state of cultural invisibility despite its neurological reality, with many people still unaware that aphantasia exists as a legitimate neurological variation. And even now, with increased awareness and research attention, individuals with aphantasia must constantly explain and defend their different way of processing reality, navigating a world designed with the assumption that everyone experiences consciousness through visual mental imagery. Yet despite these challenges, many individuals with aphantasia have developed remarkable compensatory strengths, excelling in logical reasoning, mathematics, and verbal processing, suggesting that the brain's resources redirected away from visual imagination may enhance other cognitive domains, and this reframing offers an important perspective shift, that aphantasia represents not a deficit or disorder, but rather a neurodivergent way of being that simply requires the world to expand its understanding of how human minds can work. Understanding aphantasia ultimately invites us to reconsider what we mean by imagination itself, that it is not a single monolithic faculty, but rather a diverse spectrum of mental capacities. And as neuroscience continues to illuminate the brain's remarkable plasticity and the many ways consciousness can be organized, individuals with aphantasia serve as a powerful reminder that human cognition is far more varied and beautiful than any single definition could capture. Imagine waking up one morning and discovering that when you hear a musical note, you don't just hear it with your ears. You see a specific color blooming in your mind's eye with absolute clarity and consistency, such that every time you encounter that same note, the identical hue appears without fail or variation. Or picture yourself reading a page of numbers where the digit 3 is invariably golden, the number 7 perpetually violet, and 5 always emerges as a deep crimson shade, a phenomenon that has persisted since childhood with unwavering accuracy and precision. This is the lived reality of individuals with synesthesia, a neurological condition where stimulation of one sensory pathway automatically and involuntarily triggers experiences in another, entirely separate sensory channel, creating a genuine crossing of neural wires that exists as a documented and measurable phenomenon within the architecture of the human brain itself. The mechanism behind this unusual crosswiring appears to involve an atypical pattern of neural connectivity during development, where the segregated pathways that normally keep our sensory systems compartmentalized instead form unexpected bridges and connections, allowing sensory information to bleed across traditional boundaries and creating tangled networks where sight, sound, taste, and touch become unnaturally intertwined. Brain imaging studies have revealed that individuals with synesthesia show heightened activity in regions associated with sensory processing and integration, suggesting that their neural highways quite literally run in different directions than those of the general population, with additional connections activated during sensory stimulation that would remain dormant in typical brains. What remains profoundly unsettling is not merely the existence of synesthesia itself, but rather the recognition that this condition provides irrefutable evidence of how arbitrary and malleable our sensory experience truly is, and how the stable, unified perception we believe we possess might be merely one particular arrangement of neural firing patterns that could be rewired in fundamentally different ways without changing our conscious experience or our sense of self. If a synesthete's brain were somehow rewired to process colors as sounds instead, they would experience an entirely alien sensory world, yet their subjective sense of continuity and identity would likely remain intact, suggesting that consciousness itself may be fundamentally indifferent to the specific sensory channels through which it receives information, caring only that the patterns of meaning remain coherent and consistent. This possibility opens a dizzying philosophical vista. Perhaps what we call normal perception is itself simply the most common form of synesthesia, an arbitrary default configuration rather than any kind of objective truth about reality, and the synesthete's experience merely highlights the profound contingency underlying all conscious sensation. That the specific sensory map each of us carries through the world is less a window onto objective reality and more a deeply personal invention, unique to the particular wiring of our individual brains. Yet this revelation need not diminish the synesthete's experience or render it merely subjective and therefore less real. Rather, it illuminates a truth applicable to all of us, that the richness of consciousness lies not in accessing some pure unmediated reality, but in the particular texture and depth of meaning that our individual neural architectures allow us to construct and inhabit, making each person's sensory world a legitimate and irreducible universe unto itself. Imagine sitting in a meeting where you present what you believe to be an entirely original idea, only to discover weeks later that you had encountered that exact concept in a book you read years ago, a conversation you had forgotten, or a film you watched in passing, and yet your mind had reconstructed it as something new and authentically yours, a phenomenon so common among writers, musicians, scientists, and creative professionals that it has spawned countless legal disputes, damaged friendships, and created genuine confusion about the true origins of intellectual work. Cryptomnesia, derived from the Greek words meaning hidden memory, describes the unconscious recollection of information or ideas that were previously encountered but then forgotten, only to be retrieved later without any conscious awareness that the idea had been experienced before, making the person genuinely believe they have created something original when in reality they are simply reproducing something their brain had stored away in the depths of long-term memory. The mechanism operates through a peculiar disconnect between our explicit memory systems, which track where and when we learn something, and our implicit memory systems, which retain the content itself without the contextual metadata. So when you recall an idea, your brain retrieves the information but fails to retrieve the source tag, leaving you with a sense of creative ownership that feels entirely authentic, because there is no internal flag warning you that this thought has traveled through your mind before. This process becomes even more complicated when we consider that our brains are constantly absorbing information from countless sources, much of which is only partially processed or experienced in a state of divided attention, and years may pass before that fragmentary exposure resurfaces in consciousness as something that feels freshly imagined, particularly when the original exposure was brief, peripheral, or encountered in a different context than where it reemerges. What makes cryptomnesia persist as a widespread cognitive phenomenon is that it is nearly impossible to guard against, for no amount of conscientiousness or good faith can prevent your brain from occasionally losing track of the source of an idea, and even the most vigilant and honest creators among us have likely experienced moments where we unknowingly reproduce something we had encountered before. Meaning that the boundary between inspiration and inadvertent plagiarism becomes blurred at the neurological level. The question then becomes not whether cryptomnesia will happen to us, but rather how we might respond when we discover that an idea we championed as our own was, in fact, borrowed from the depths of our forgotten memory, and whether such unconscious reproduction should be treated with the same moral weight as deliberate theft, or whether it deserves a more nuanced understanding that acknowledges the genuine innocence of the mind that simply failed to maintain proper filing of its sources. History offers us numerous documented cases of this phenomenon. Friedrich Nietzsche unknowingly repeated ideas from philosophers he had read decades earlier. George Harrison's "My Sweet Lord" bore striking similarities to "He's So Fine," despite Harrison's genuine belief in its originality. And countless scientists have independently arrived at the same breakthrough, only to discover their predecessors had reached it first. Suggesting that cryptomnesia may operate not as a personal failing, but as an inevitable tax paid by creative minds operating at the edge of human knowledge and expression. Imagine sitting in a meeting at work and suddenly remembering a brilliant solution to a problem that has been plaguing your team for weeks, and you share this insight with genuine confidence and enthusiasm, only to have a colleague quietly mention that you yourself proposed this exact same idea 3 months ago in a different meeting. And the realization that floods through you in that moment is both humbling and deeply unsettling because you have absolutely no memory of ever thinking of it before. This phenomenon is called source amnesia, and it represents one of the most peculiar and unsettling failures of human memory, wherein we retain information with crystalline clarity, yet somehow completely lose track of where that information originated or how we came to know it in the first place. The mechanics of this peculiar glitch are rooted in the fundamental architecture of how our brains store and retrieve memories. For the brain appears to organize information into distinct neural systems, with one system dedicated to storing the content itself and entirely separate systems responsible for cataloging the contextual details surrounding that content, including where we heard it, who told us, what time of day it was, or what we were wearing when we learned it. When these contextual memory systems fail to encode properly, or when they deteriorate faster than the core information itself, we are left with what neuroscientists call a floating memory, a piece of knowledge that exists in our minds unmoored from its origins, and this creates a kind of cognitive orphan that our brain attempts to assign a new parent to, often incorrectly. What makes source amnesia particularly unsettling is that it operates silently and without our awareness, meaning we confidently believe we have generated an original thought or remembered something we actually encountered elsewhere, and we proceed through the world with false confidence in the authorship of our own ideas, never suspecting that we have unknowingly plagiarized from our own past or from external sources we cannot recall, and this happens with remarkable frequency in everyday life. Yet most of us move through our existence barely acknowledging how often our sense of originality and memory is fundamentally compromised by this invisible mechanism. Studies have shown that source amnesia becomes even more pronounced in our digital age, where we encounter information from countless sources: social media posts, articles, overheard conversations, podcasts, creating an overwhelming cacophony of input that our brains simply cannot adequately catalog. And perhaps this explains why so many of us feel like we are merely recirculating ideas rather than generating truly novel thoughts. Caught in an endless cycle of forgotten origins that makes it nearly impossible to trace the genealogy of our own consciousness. And yet, perhaps this cognitive vulnerability also reveals something profound about the nature of human thought itself. That originality may be less about generating ideas from nothing and more about the subtle recombination and recontextualization of information we have absorbed, digested, and forgotten, suggesting that we are all, in a sense, engaged in an elaborate collaborative thinking process with every mind whose ideas have touched ours, even when we cannot remember their names. In this light, source amnesia transforms from a mere cognitive failure into something closer to a feature of human consciousness, a necessary forgetting that allows us to build upon the ideas of others without being paralyzed by the weight of attribution, even as it raises uncomfortable questions about intellectual honesty and the true ownership of thought itself. Consider the moment when you watch a film for the second time, and suddenly you believe you predicted every plot twist, every betrayal, every moment of revelation, when in reality you sat there the first time genuinely surprised, genuinely uncertain about what would happen next, yet now your memory has been rewritten by the knowledge you possess, convincing you that the ending was obvious all along, that you somehow already knew what you were about to see. This is hindsight bias distortion, one of the most pervasive and insidious cognitive distortions that shapes how we remember our own mental states and the accuracy of our predictions. When we know the outcome of an event, our brains retroactively alter our memories of what we thought would happen before that outcome occurred, making us believe that we possessed knowledge or certainty that we did not actually possess at the time of the original prediction. The psychological mechanism driving this phenomenon operates through the way our brains construct narratives and store memories, creating a coherent story that integrates what we now know with what we believed we knew. And in the process, the original uncertainty becomes obscured, buried beneath layers of false confidence that feel absolutely authentic to our conscious awareness. This distortion serves no logical purpose, yet it persists universally across human populations, manifesting in our relationships when we insist we knew a partnership would fail, in our financial decisions when we convince ourselves we could have seen the market crash coming, in our medical choices when we believe we should have recognized the symptoms earlier, and in our professional lives when we swear we understood the direction a project would take before it actually took that direction. We have normalized this cognitive failure so completely that we rarely question the authenticity of our own memories of our own confidence levels, accepting without examination the narrative our brain constructs for us, allowing hindsight bias to reshape not only how we remember the past, but fundamentally how we evaluate our own judgment and wisdom. The tragedy of this distortion lies in its self-reinforcing cycle. We misremember our past predictions as accurate, which inflates our confidence in our current judgment, which leads us to make future decisions with unwarranted certainty, only to repeat the same cognitive distortion when those outcomes arrive and we retroactively convince ourselves we saw them coming all along. And perhaps the deepest consequence is that this distortion prevents us from ever truly learning from our mistakes, because we cannot accurately assess what we failed to predict when we have already rewritten our memories to suggest we predicted it all along, leaving us trapped in a loop where we believe ourselves wiser than we actually are, repeating the same errors while remaining convinced of our own prescience. The only escape from this trap requires deliberate effort. We must document our actual predictions before outcomes occur, create written records of our genuine uncertainty, and force ourselves to review these archives with honest eyes, comparing what we truly thought with what we now claim to have thought. A practice so uncomfortable that most of us abandon it almost immediately, preferring instead the comforting illusion of our own foresight. Yet even when we recognize this distortion intellectually and commit to documenting our predictions, we discover that hindsight bias operates so silently, so invisibly, that we often fail to maintain the discipline required. The very act of reviewing our past uncertainty threatens our current self-image, and so we find reasons to abandon the practice, convincing ourselves that we have learned enough. Consider the phenomenon where individuals with minimal knowledge or expertise in a particular domain express confidence in their understanding that far exceeds what their actual competence would justify. A peculiar inversion of humility that plays out countless times each day in workplaces, classrooms, and online spaces across the world. A person who has spent merely a few hours learning about nutrition might confidently advise others on complex dietary protocols, or someone who has watched a handful of documentary films about psychology might present themselves as qualified to diagnose mental illness in their friends and family members, speaking with an unwarranted certainty that belies the shallow foundation of their knowledge. This cognitive bias emerges from a fundamentally asymmetrical distribution of self-awareness, wherein the knowledge required to recognize one's own ignorance is precisely the same knowledge one does not yet possess, creating an impossible logical loop. When we lack expertise in a field, we lack the cognitive framework necessary to perceive the boundaries of what we do not know, and this absence of awareness creates a dangerous confidence, a comfortable sense that we understand more than we actually. The mechanism operates because our brains construct narratives of competence based on the information we do possess, and these partial understandings feel surprisingly complete from the inside, creating an illusion of mastery that seems entirely reasonable from our limited perspective. What makes this particularly insidious is that as people acquire genuine expertise over time, they often become more cautious in their claims, recognizing the vast complexity and nuance they had previously overlooked. Yet the cycle perpetually repeats itself at new domains of knowledge. We have normalized this contradiction so thoroughly that we rarely acknowledge the fundamental strangeness of it, this strange dance where confidence and ignorance move together in perfect synchronization, each feeding the other in an endless cycle that persists despite our awareness of its existence. The paradox deepens when we recognize that pointing out this bias to others often triggers defensiveness rather than reflection, as the very confidence that blinds us to our ignorance also insulates us from correction, making the afflicted largely immune to the cure that awareness might provide. Yet perhaps this mechanism exists not as a flaw, but as a necessary feature of human ambition. Without some baseline confidence in our partial understanding, we might never attempt to learn anything at all, paralyzed instead by the recognition of how much we do not know. The challenge then becomes not the elimination of this confidence, but its calibration, learning to hold our convictions lightly enough to remain open to contradiction, while maintaining enough conviction to move forward into the uncertain territories where all genuine learning occurs. This balance point, where confidence and humility coexist, represents perhaps the most elusive form of wisdom, knowing enough to act while knowing enough to doubt. The individuals who achieve this balance, who remain perpetually curious students even as they accumulate expertise, become recognizable by their tendency to qualify their statements with nuance, to say, "in my experience," rather than "the truth is," and to treat their conclusions as provisional maps rather than permanent territory. They understand that the confidence required to act and the humility required to learn are not opposing forces, but complementary capacities that must be held in tension, each one tempering the excesses of the other. Consider the moment when you have formed a belief about something, whether it concerns a person in your life, a political position, a health remedy, or an explanation for why something happened, and then notice how your mind begins to work in a peculiar direction that you may not even consciously recognize. Because once that initial belief takes root in your thinking, your brain develops an almost magnetic attraction to any information that seems to support it, while simultaneously filtering out, dismissing or reinterpreting anything that might contradict it. This phenomenon, known as confirmation bias, operates so quietly and so completely that you can spend years reinforcing the same beliefs while genuinely believing you are being objective and rational about them. Imagine a person who becomes convinced that a particular diet is the cure for their fatigue, and from that moment forward, every time they feel energized after eating in that specific way, they remember it vividly and attribute the energy directly to the diet. But whenever they feel tired after following the diet exactly as planned, they convince themselves that they must have done something else wrong, or they simply forget about that instance entirely because it doesn't fit the narrative they have constructed. The mechanism underlying this bias stems from the way our brains actually operate, which is fundamentally different from how we imagine they operate, because our minds are not neutral recording devices passively observing reality. Instead, they are prediction machines constantly working to confirm the models they have already built. And once a model is in place, the brain actually becomes more efficient by prioritizing information that fits the existing framework while using enormous cognitive resources to explain away or ignore contradictory data. This creates a self-reinforcing loop where your beliefs become increasingly resistant to challenge, not because you are stupid or deliberately dishonest, but because your brain is literally working against the incorporation of disconfirming evidence at a neurological level, filtering it before it even reaches your conscious awareness. The truly unsettling aspect of confirmation bias is how completely normal and invisible this process feels from the inside, and how we have all learned to construct elaborate justifications for why information that challenges our beliefs is somehow less credible, less reliable, or less relevant than information that supports them. And we do this so fluently and automatically that we rarely notice we are doing it at all. The result is a kind of intellectual prison that we construct without realizing it, one where we become increasingly confident in our beliefs precisely because we have successfully filtered out all the evidence that might have challenged them, leaving us to interpret our own certainty as proof of our accuracy rather than as a warning sign that we should be more skeptical of what we think we know. The antidote to this trap is not simply to seek out opposing views, but to deliberately practice what psychologists call consider the opposite, actively imagining specific ways you could be wrong, examining the strongest versions of arguments against your position rather than their weakest strawman versions, and most importantly, cultivating a genuine curiosity about what evidence would actually change your mind, because if you cannot articulate what would convince you otherwise, you have already surrendered your thinking to the bias. This practice of specifying your falsifiability conditions transforms you from a passive believer into an active skeptic of your own certainties, and it is perhaps the most difficult intellectual work you can do, precisely because it requires you to gen. Imagine a person who has built their entire identity around being environmentally conscious, yet they drive a large SUV to work alone every single day, produce significant waste, and purchase fast fashion without hesitation. When confronted with the contradiction between their values and their actions, they experience a genuine psychological discomfort that is not imaginary but neurologically real, a form of mental pain that registers in the brain similar to physical distress. This phenomenon, known as cognitive dissonance, represents one of the most peculiar and inescapable aspects of human consciousness, where our minds literally hurt when we hold two conflicting beliefs simultaneously or when our actions betray our stated values. The brain, in its quest for internal consistency and coherence, experiences this mismatch as an error signal, triggering genuine anxiety and discomfort that can manifest as irritability, avoidance, rationalization, or defensive anger. What makes this particularly fascinating is that cognitive dissonance operates entirely beneath the threshold of logical reasoning, because the pain is real regardless of whether the conflicting beliefs have any actual merit. A person might hold the contradictory belief that smoking is terrible for health while also smoking 20 cigarettes daily, and rather than simply quitting or accepting their choice, they will experience genuine distress that often leads to elaborate justifications, such as claiming they exercise enough to compensate or that they will quit tomorrow. The human mind possesses an almost unlimited capacity to rationalize away these contradictions, creating false narratives and explanations that feel convincing in the moment, allowing us to reduce the psychological pain without addressing the actual contradiction. We have normalized this mental discomfort so thoroughly that most people experience it daily without recognizing it for what it is, attributing the resulting anxiety to external circumstances rather than the internal conflict generating it. The tragedy of cognitive dissonance is that we often choose comfort over change, selecting the path of self-deception rather than the harder work of genuine alignment between belief and action. Yet perhaps the deepest pain lies not in the dissonance itself, but in the moment of clarity when we can no longer deny the contradiction, when rationalization fails, and we must finally choose between who we claim to be and who we actually are, a choice that demands the courage to either transform ourselves or accept our own hypocrisy. And it is in this crucible of choice that many people discover they prefer the familiar pain of dissonance to the uncertain pain of transformation, discovering that self-awareness without action can become its own form of torture, a chronic low-grade suffering that whispers to us daily about the gap between our ideals and our reality. This is perhaps why so many of us become expert architects of compartmentalization, constructing mental walls that keep our contradictions safely separated from our conscious awareness, allowing us to be the environmentalist on weekends and the consumer on weekdays, the loving parent who loses their temper, the justice seeker who ignores injustice when it requires personal sacrifice, each identity living in its own sealed chamber, never forced to confront the others. Until the walls crack, as they inevitably must, and we are forced to inhabit all our contradictions at once, a moment that arrives not as enlightenment but as collapse, when the energy required to maintain our compartments finally exhausts us, and we discover that the pain of dissonance was always cheaper than the pain of integration. Consider the experience of lying in bed at night, suspended in that peculiar state between wakefulness and sleep, when your mind begins to produce vivid sensations that feel entirely real yet have no basis in external reality. You might see shadowy figures moving across your bedroom walls, or hear distinct voices calling your name from the darkness, or feel the unmistakable sensation of a presence standing at the foot of your bed, watching you with an intensity that sends your heart racing. These are hypnagogic hallucinations, and they occur specifically during the transition into sleep when your conscious mind is relinquishing control, but your brain has not yet fully surrendered to unconsciousness. During this threshold state, your visual cortex becomes increasingly active while your prefrontal cortex, the region responsible for reality testing and logical evaluation, begins to disengage and lose its authority over your perception. This means your brain is generating sensory experiences with the same neurological intensity as genuine perceptions, yet simultaneously lacks the cognitive machinery to question or verify them as impossible or illusory. What makes this phenomenon particularly unsettling is that you are aware enough to recognize something is happening, yet not aware enough to immediately dismiss it as unreal, creating a disorienting liminal experience where the boundary between imagination and reality becomes dangerously blurred. This process occurs in virtually all human beings to some degree, particularly when sleep-deprived, stressed, or experiencing disrupted sleep cycles. Yet despite its commonality and despite our scientific understanding of its neurological basis, the experience remains deeply disturbing and often goes unreported due to social embarrassment or fear of being perceived as mentally unstable. The irony is that this very silence surrounding the experience only amplifies its power, When you finally encounter a hypnagogic hallucination, you may have no framework for understanding it, leaving you to wonder in the darkness whether you have glimpsed something genuinely supernatural or merely experienced a quirk of neurology, a distinction that feels impossibly difficult to determine in those disorienting moments between worlds. Yet this ambiguity may itself serve a psychological purpose. The inability to immediately rationalize the experience forces a confrontation with the limits of your own perception and control, a humbling reminder that your brain, for all its sophistication, remains capable of deceiving you in ways that feel utterly convincing, and that the line between the rational and the inexplicable is far more permeable than waking consciousness typically admits. Perhaps this is why hypnagogic hallucinations have haunted human folklore for centuries. Cultures across the globe have attributed these experiences to visitations from spirits, demons, or the dead, explanations that, while scientifically inaccurate, paradoxically acknowledge a profound truth: that something genuinely extraordinary is occurring within your own mind, even if the mechanism is neurological rather than supernatural. In this sense, the old explanations were not wrong so much as incomplete. They captured the phenomenological reality that something uncanny is genuinely unfolding, even if they mislabeled its origin, reminding us that scientific understanding need not diminish wonder, but rather can deepen our appreciation for the remarkable strangeness that already exists within the ordinary architecture of human consciousness. When you finally understand that the shadowy figure at your bedroom door is merely your brain misfiring during the transition between states of consciousness, the experience loses none of its visceral power. Yuha. Consider the peculiar experience that occurs in certain neurological conditions or during moments of extreme stress, where a person reports perceiving themselves from outside their own body, floating above themselves, or watching their own form from a distance as though observing a stranger. And this sensation feels entirely real and vivid despite the obvious impossibility of such a perspective. These out-of-body experiences, or OBEs as they are commonly known, represent a fascinating failure of the brain's spatial mapping system, a disconnection between the sensory signals that normally construct our sense of embodied presence and the neural processes that integrate these signals into a unified perception of self. The mechanism underlying these illusions involves the temporoparietal junction, a region of the brain responsible for integrating sensory information from multiple sources to create our sense of where we are in space and what constitutes the boundary between our body and the external world. When this region experiences disruption through electrical stimulation during surgery, through seizure activity, through extreme stress responses, or through the effects of certain pharmaceuticals, the brain loses its ability to properly anchor consciousness to the physical body and instead generates an alternative spatial representation that feels subjectively authentic. The person experiencing this phenomenon reports absolute certainty about what they perceive, describing the sensation with striking clarity and consistency, insisting that they genuinely observed events from an external vantage point. Yet when we examine the actual circumstances of these experiences, we find that people consistently report details they could not have actually seen, or they fail to report obvious visual information that should have been available from their claimed external position. What remains deeply unsettling about these illusions is how seamlessly they integrate into memory and belief systems, how they persist even after neurological explanation has been provided, and how readily we as a culture have absorbed them into frameworks of spirituality and mysticism, rather than recognizing them simply as the brain's failure to maintain its fundamental sense of embodied reality. The cultural appetite for interpreting these neurological glitches as evidence of consciousness transcending the body reveals something profound about human nature itself: our deep resistance to accepting the brain's contingency, our need to believe that our sense of self is somehow more fundamental and separable than the fragile neural processes that actually generate it. In this way, the out-of-body illusion becomes not merely a neurological curiosity, but a mirror reflecting our species' ancient struggle to reconcile mortality with the felt certainty of an inner observer. Yet perhaps this very struggle itself, this stubborn insistence that consciousness must be something more than neural firing, hints at why the illusion proves so compelling. We are creatures shaped by evolution to experience ourselves as unified agents inhabiting bodies, and when that fundamental experience fractures, the brain's desperate attempt to restore coherence feels more authentically us than the clinical explanation ever could. This paradox that our most convincing experiences of transcendence arise precisely from the breakdown of the very neural machinery that ordinarily grounds us, suggests that consciousness itself may be far more fragile and constructed than our intuitions about it suggest. A sobering recognition that even our most intimate sense of existing as a unified self is ultimately hostage to the particular architecture of our brains. Imagine the moment when consciousness begins to return during sleep, when your mind slowly climbs back toward wakefulness and you suddenly become aware that you are dreaming, that rare and precious state of lucidity where you know you are asleep, yet fully present within the dream landscape. In this exact moment, many people experience something profoundly unsettling: a complete inability to move their body, a sudden paralysis that grips their limbs and renders them utterly immobilized despite their conscious awareness and desperate desire to move. This phenomenon, known as lucid dream paralysis or sleep paralysis with lucidity, creates an extraordinary contradiction in human experience because your mind is awake and aware while your body remains locked in the chemical constraints of sleep. During the rapid eye movement stage of sleep, your brain deliberately paralyzes your voluntary muscles to prevent you from acting out your dreams and thrashing around in bed, potentially injuring yourself or others around you. This is a protective mechanism that has existed throughout human evolution and serves a clear biological purpose. However, when consciousness returns prematurely during this stage of sleep while the paralysis chemicals remain flooding your nervous system, you experience the terror of being trapped in your own body, unable to move even a finger, unable to call out, unable to do anything but lie there in complete stillness while your mind screams inside your skull. The brain, confused and alarmed by this contradiction, often fills the paralysis with intense fear, and sometimes with hallucinations of presences, shadows, or pressure on the chest, adding psychological horror to the physical immobility. What makes this experience persist so powerfully in human consciousness is that even though we now understand the exact neurological mechanism behind it, even though we can explain it completely with chemistry and sleep science, people continue to feel profound terror during these episodes because knowledge does not override the ancient survival instincts that interpret paralysis as a threat to life itself. Throughout history, cultures have interpreted these episodes through different lenses: demons sitting on the sleeper's chest in medieval Europe, the old hag in folklore, the shadow figure in contemporary accounts. Yet the underlying experience remains universally terrifying, suggesting that some fears are hardwired so deeply into our nervous system that they transcend both time and rational understanding. And perhaps this is the deepest irony of lucid dream paralysis. The very lucidity that allows us to recognize we are dreaming, that intellectual triumph of consciousness, becomes the instrument of our terror, because a mind fully aware cannot easily dismiss what it experiences as mere dream logic, and so it fights against the paralysis with an intensity that only deepens the fear, creating a feedback loop where knowledge and instinct collide in the darkness of half-sleep. Some people report that acceptance, the counterintuitive act of surrendering to the paralysis rather than fighting it, can dissolve the episode more quickly, suggesting that the mind's resistance itself may be the true prison, and that liberation sometimes requires us to stop struggling against the very constraints we cannot physically escape. Yet even this wisdom, that surrender brings relief, remains difficult to access in the moment when your conscious mind is flooded with adrenaline and primitive alarm, which is perhaps why lucid dream paralysis continues to haunt human experience despite our scientific understanding, reminding us that consciousness itself is far more fragmented and vulnerable than we typically assume in our waking hours. Have you ever sat down with a pen and paper, allowed your hand to move freely without conscious direction, and discovered that coherent words or even complete sentences had been written by your own hand, yet you have no clear memory of forming them deliberately? This phenomenon, known as automatic writing, has captivated human curiosity for centuries, appearing in spiritualist movements, psychological research, and personal journals throughout history, and it represents one of the most unsettling disconnects between intention and action that the human mind can produce. The experience typically begins innocuously enough, with a person holding a writing instrument loosely while remaining in a state of relaxed consciousness, sometimes gazing away from the paper, sometimes meditating or focusing their thoughts elsewhere entirely, and gradually they notice that their hand has begun moving across the page with apparent autonomy, producing marks that eventually resolve into recognizable words and phrases. The written content often surprises the writer themselves, containing thoughts they did not consciously formulate, information they do not recall knowing, or emotional expressions that feel alien to their current state of mind, leading many to ascribe these messages to external sources such as spirits, unconscious guides, or supernatural entities. However, the psychological explanation for automatic writing is far more terrestrial and rooted in the remarkable capabilities of the subconscious mind, which processes vastly more information than conscious awareness can handle and maintains extensive memories, associations, and knowledge that remain inaccessible during normal waking thought. The motor cortex and the systems governing fine motor control can operate with minimal conscious supervision, as evidenced by the ease with which we drive familiar routes without remembering the journey or type lengthy messages while distracted by conversation. And when the conscious mind is sufficiently relaxed or diverted, these motor systems can access stored information and produce output that feels external to the self. What makes automatic writing particularly fascinating and deeply unsettling is that it persists as a meaningful practice despite our understanding of these mechanisms, suggesting that the mystery lies not in the phenomenon itself, but in our profound disconnect from our own mental processes and our tendency to experience our subconscious outputs as foreign voices rather than genuine expressions of our own multifaceted minds. The true mystery, then, may be not whether spirits guide our hands, but rather why we find it so difficult to accept that our own minds contain depths and dimensions that operate beyond the reach of our conscious awareness, and whether the act of automatic writing serves primarily as a window into the subconscious, or as a mirror reflecting our deep need to believe that something larger than our everyday selves is speaking through us. Perhaps the most compelling aspect of automatic writing is that it forces us to confront the uncomfortable truth that consciousness is not a unified entity commanding a singular body, but rather a collection of competing processes, memories, and impulses that we experience as seamless only because our brain excels at creating the illusion of coherence and control. In this light, automatic writing becomes less a paranormal curiosity and more a practical demonstration of how readily our brains can compartmentalize function, delegate control, and generate content that feels genuinely alien even when originating from within our own neural architecture. Have you ever walked into a room you have never visited before, yet felt an overwhelming sense of familiarity wash over you, as though you had lived that exact moment at some point in your past, even though your rational mind knows with absolute certainty that you have never been there? This phenomenon, known as déjà vu, which translates from French as already seen, occurs in approximately 70% of the human population at least once in their lifetime, and for many people, it happens repeatedly throughout their years, each instance accompanied by that strange, unsettling feeling of temporal displacement. The experience typically lasts only a few seconds before fading away, leaving you with a lingering sense of confusion about what your mind just experienced. Neuroscientists believe that déjà vu represents a glitch in the brain's memory retrieval system, a moment when the neural mechanisms responsible for recognizing new situations accidentally activate the same pathways associated with familiar experiences, creating a false sense of recognition without any actual basis in your personal history. This misfire might occur because a current sensory input, a particular combination of smells, sounds, lighting, or spatial arrangement, partially matches the memory traces of a completely different experience, causing your brain's pattern recognition system to incorrectly flag the present moment as something previously encountered. The unsettling nature of déjà vu lies in this fundamental contradiction. Your conscious mind knows you have never seen this place before, yet your deeper cognitive systems insist that you have, and this disagreement between different levels of consciousness creates that distinctive feeling of wrongness and alienation from reality. What makes this phenomenon particularly fascinating from a neurological perspective is that despite decades of research and countless theories about its mechanisms, we still do not fully understand why this particular glitch persists in human cognition, nor why our brains have evolved in such a way that these memory errors continue to occur, suggesting that the systems producing déjà vu might serve some other purpose we have not yet identified. Or perhaps they are simply an acceptable cost of having such a powerful and complex memory storage system. Whatever the ultimate explanation, déjà vu reminds us that our brains are not infallible recording devices, but rather dynamic systems constantly interpreting and reinterpreting the world around us, occasionally stumbling in ways that reveal the hidden architecture of human consciousness itself. In this way, déjà vu serves as a humbling reminder of the gap between our subjective experience of reality and the actual mechanics of perception. A gap that likely contains many other quirks and mysteries about human consciousness still waiting to be discovered and understood by future neuroscientific research. Perhaps most intriguingly, some researchers have begun investigating whether déjà vu experiences might actually offer us valuable insights into how memory itself is organized and retrieved, suggesting that these momentary glitches, far from being mere errors, could serve as natural windows into the otherwise hidden processes by which our brains construct, store, and access the vast archive of experiences that constitute our sense of self. By studying the conditions under which déjà vu occurs, whether during stress, fatigue, or heightened emotional states, neuroscientists may eventually decode the fundamental rules governing how our brains distinguish between genuine memories and false ones, potentially revolutionizing our understanding of memory disorders, consciousness, and the very nature of what it means to remember at all. Imagine standing in your own home, a place where you have lived for years, surrounded by furniture you chose and arranged, walking through hallways you traverse every single day, and suddenly everything feels alien and unfamiliar, as though you have never seen these rooms before in your life, even though you know with absolute certainty that you have lived here for a very long time. This is the phenomenon known as Jamais Vu, which translates from French as never seen, and it represents the inverse of the more commonly discussed déjà vu experience. While déjà vu involves the uncanny sensation that you are experiencing something for the first time when you have actually encountered it before, Jamais vu creates the deeply unsettling feeling that something intensely familiar has become completely foreign and unknown. The experience typically lasts only seconds or minutes, but during that window of time, your brain seems to temporarily disconnect the experiential component of memory from the recognition component, leaving you feeling like a visitor in your own life. Neurologically, what appears to be happening is a temporary disruption in the neural pathways that bind semantic memory, which stores facts and general knowledge, with episodic memory, which stores personal experiences and contextual details about those experiences. When these normally integrated systems fail to communicate properly, you know intellectually that you should recognize something, yet your emotional and perceptual systems refuse to acknowledge that familiarity. The stranger aspect of Jamais vu is how it persists despite occurring in people across all demographics and educational backgrounds, suggesting it is a fundamental quirk of human consciousness rather than a sign of neurological disease or psychological disorder. We have normalized this phenomenon to such a degree that most people simply wait for the sensation to pass, understanding intuitively that their brain is temporarily malfunctioning in a harmless way. Yet we have never truly explained why this malfunction occurs or what purpose it might serve in the architecture of human memory. Perhaps Jamais vu serves as a reminder that our sense of self and belonging is not as solid as we assume, that consciousness is constantly reconstructing reality moment by moment, and that the feeling of home depends entirely on neural processes that can, without warning, temporarily suspend their operation and leave us fundamentally, if briefly, untethered from the world we thought we knew. In those fleeting moments of estrangement from the familiar, we catch a glimpse of how fragile the bonds between self and world truly are, and perhaps it is in this vulnerability that we discover the most honest truth about human existence, that we are never truly at home anywhere, but only ever becoming at home through the continuous, miraculous work of memory and recognition that our brains perform without our awareness or consent. Yet this very fragility may be what allows us to remain open to transformation, to see our lives and spaces with fresh eyes when the neural filters momentarily lift, and to recognize that the deepest familiarity is not something we possess, but something we must continually, consciously choose to maintain. In this way, Jamais vu becomes not merely a glitch in the machinery of consciousness, but a profound invitation to question what we mean by familiarity itself, and to recognize that the act of truly knowing anything, including ourselves, is an endless process of re-recognition rather than a state we ever permanently achieve. Imagine standing in a conversation where someone describes an event, a person, or a concept that you are absolutely certain you should know, yet the knowledge remains frustratingly locked away behind an impenetrable mental barrier, and this state is called Presque Vu, which is French for almost seen, representing the inverse of the more commonly known déjà vu experience, where everything feels familiar despite being new. In Presque Vu, the sensation is one of profound alienation from your own knowledge, where you possess the complete conviction that information exists somewhere in your memory, but cannot access it no matter how desperately you concentrate or how many mental pathways you attempt to traverse. The person explaining something references a movie you have definitely watched, or mentions an actor whose face you can visualize with perfect clarity, or discusses a historical event you studied years ago. And yet when you try to retrieve the name, the title, or the specific details, your mind produces only a blank expanse where information should reside. What makes this phenomenon particularly torturous is that the knowledge is not gone because you remember that you remember, you possess a memory of having the memory, which creates a paradoxical state where certainty and complete inability exist simultaneously in your consciousness. The psychological mechanism underlying Presque Vu appears to involve a breakdown in the retrieval pathways of long-term memory, where the semantic network that should connect related concepts and stored information has somehow become temporarily disconnected or blocked, much like a road you know exists, but cannot currently access despite knowing exactly where it should be. Your brain recognizes contextual cues that typically trigger associated memories, but the final bridge between recognition and recall fails to form, leaving you suspended in a state of knowing that you should know without the ability to actually know. Unlike simple forgetting, where information has genuinely dissolved, Presque Vu involves the metacognitive awareness that the information persists, which intensifies the psychological discomfort exponentially because you are simultaneously aware of both the existence and the inaccessibility of what you seek. Despite decades of cognitive research and our advancing understanding of memory systems, we continue to experience Presque Vu regularly and accept it as an inevitable feature of consciousness, even though it represents a clear malfunction in systems that have otherwise become remarkably reliable through millions of years of evolution, suggesting that this particular cognitive failure may be the inevitable cost of possessing a memory system complex enough to be aware of its own limitations. The torture intensifies when someone finally provides the answer moments later, and you experience the simultaneous relief of retrieval and the crushing realization that the information was indeed there all along, perfectly preserved, waiting behind a door your mind simply could not find the key to open. The cruelest aspect is recognizing that you will likely experience this same torture again with the same information, that the retrieval pathway remains fragile and unreliable even after being successfully accessed, condemning you to repeat this cycle of certainty, frustration, and eventual discovery across the span of your lifetime, forever haunted by the knowledge that your mind contains vast archives of experience you cannot freely explore. This is perhaps why Presque Vu feels less like a simple memory lapse and more like a betrayal by the very architecture of consciousness itself, a reminder that the mind's greatest strength, its capacity for vast, intricate storage, comes paired with an equally vast. Consider a moment when you repeat a word over and over again, speaking it aloud or thinking it repeatedly in your mind, until gradually the word begins to lose all meaning, becoming nothing more than a peculiar sound without substance or significance, a hollow echo of language stripped of its communicative purpose. This phenomenon is called semantic satiation, and it represents one of the mind's most unsettling capabilities to divorce itself from the very tools we use to understand reality itself. When you say the word lamp 20 times in rapid succession, something strange happens in your brain where the neural pathways responsible for processing that word's meaning become fatigued and temporarily cease firing, leaving you with the sound alone, the shape of the letters, but no comprehension of what a lamp actually is. The mechanism underlying this effect involves the gradual depletion of neurotransmitters in the specific brain regions dedicated to processing semantic information, those tiny chemical messengers becoming exhausted from repeated activation until they simply cannot transmit their signals with the same efficiency they once did. It is as though your brain has a finite amount of resources allocated to each concept, and when you demand that resource be used repeatedly without pause, it depletes like a battery drained by constant use, leaving only silence and confusion in its wake. What makes this particularly unsettling is that semantic satiation reveals how fragile our grasp on meaning truly is, how the connection between a word and its referent is not some permanent, solid thing etched into our consciousness, but rather a delicate electrochemical process that can be disrupted through simple repetition. suggesting that our entire understanding of the world rests upon processes so tenuous and vulnerable that they can be temporarily erased through nothing more than persistence and time. And yet we move through our days accepting this precarious arrangement without question or concern. Perhaps this is why we rarely notice semantic satiation in everyday life. Our minds are merciful enough to prevent us from dwelling too long on any single concept, rotating our attention across the vast landscape of language like a gardener tending different plots, ensuring that no one meaning ever withers completely from overuse. And yet, in those rare moments when we do push a word beyond its limits, we glimpse the machinery beneath consciousness itself. That fragile architecture upon which all thought and understanding depends. And perhaps this is why mystics and monks have long practiced repetitive chanting and mantra recitation, not to reinforce meaning, but to dissolve it entirely, to strip away the conceptual layers of language until what remains is pure sensation, pure presence, a temporary escape from the tyranny of semantic content that normally anchors us to consensus reality. In this dissolution of meaning lies a paradox. By temporarily destroying the word, we paradoxically reconnect with something more fundamental than language itself, a direct encounter with consciousness untethered from the symbols that usually mediate our experience, reminding us that beneath the endless chatter of our semantic minds exists a silent substrate of pure awareness that existed long before we had words to name it. Yet this glimpse into the wordless foundation of consciousness remains fleeting, for as soon as we cease our repetition and allow the neurotransmitters to replenish themselves, meaning rushes back in like water filling a vessel, and we are once again prisoners of language, bound to its categories and limitations, unable to sustain that momentary liberation from the symbolic order that structures all our thoughts. There exists a peculiar state of consciousness that most people experience regularly, yet few truly understand, where a word or name sits just beyond the reach of your conscious retrieval, hovering in a maddening space between knowing and not knowing, between memory and amnesia, suspended in what researchers call the tip-of-tongue phenomenon. You find yourself in conversation or writing, the thought forms clearly in your mind, the concept is absolutely there, you know precisely what you want to say or name, and yet the specific word refuses to surface, it remains locked away behind some invisible barrier in your memory, and the harder you strain to retrieve it, the more elusive it becomes, like trying to grab smoke with your bare hands. Often you can recall peripheral details about the word itself. Perhaps it starts with a certain letter, maybe it has a particular number of syllables, you might even remember words that sound similar or mean similar things. Yet the exact target word continues its retreat into the depths of your mind. This experience is not a failure of your memory system, but rather a peculiar glimpse into how your brain actually stores and retrieves information, revealing that memories exist on a spectrum of accessibility rather than being simply present or absent. The mechanism behind this phenomenon involves the separation of different components of a memory, where semantic information about a word, its meaning and associations, may be fully accessible while the phonological form, the actual sound and pronunciation of the word, remains temporarily blocked from retrieval. Sometimes the word suddenly materializes minutes or hours later, often when you have stopped actively searching for it, suggesting that your unconscious mind continues working on the problem even after your conscious attention has moved elsewhere. What makes this particularly unsettling is that we have normalized this strange limbo state as simply part of being human, accepting that our minds can simultaneously know and not know something with perfect confidence, and we wait patiently, sometimes in frustrated silence, knowing with absolute certainty that the word we seek exists within us, trapped in a temporary prison of our own neurology. A vivid reminder that consciousness and memory are far more fragmented and mysterious than our everyday experience suggests. Yet perhaps the most revealing aspect of this phenomenon is how it exposes the difference between knowing something and being able to access it, a distinction that challenges our intuitive sense of what memory actually is, suggesting that the architecture of our minds contains far more information than we can consciously articulate at any given moment, a humbling reminder that the self we experience is merely the tip of an incomprehensibly vast cognitive iceberg. This gap between knowing and accessing also hints at why we sometimes feel like strangers to ourselves, why we cannot always articulate our own thoughts or feelings despite sensing they exist fully formed within us. And it suggests that true self-knowledge may be less about what we consciously know and more about developing patient awareness of the vast terrain of ourselves we cannot yet reach. In this sense, the tip-of-tongue experience becomes a meditation on acceptance itself, a recurring invitation to surrender our illusion of complete self-mastery and to recognize that the mind operates according to rhythms we cannot force, that some knowledge must be allowed to emerge in its own time rather than seized through sheer effort of will. Perhaps this is why so many spiritual traditions emphasize the paradox of seeking without grasping, understanding that the deepest truths, like those elusive words, often arrive only when we stop desperately see. Consider the peculiar experience that befalls countless individuals who have spent extended periods engaged with the video game Tetris, a seemingly simple puzzle game involving falling geometric shapes that must be arranged into complete horizontal lines. After hours of gameplay, these players report that when they close their eyes to sleep, or even when they glance away from the screen and look at their surroundings, they continue to see those same tetramino shapes falling, rotating, and fitting together across their visual field, overlaying the actual environment before them like a persistent phantom image. This phenomenon, formally recognized by cognitive scientists as the Tetris effect, demonstrates how intensely the human brain can become saturated with a particular visual and motor pattern, imprinting it so deeply into the neural pathways responsible for perception and attention that the mind continues processing these patterns even after the external stimulus has been removed. The mechanism operates through a process called perceptual priming, wherein repeated exposure to specific visual information strengthens the neural circuits dedicated to recognizing and responding to those patterns, essentially training vast networks of neurons to fire in synchronization whenever they encounter related stimuli. What makes this effect particularly fascinating is that it transcends the boundary between voluntary attention and involuntary perception, revealing that our conscious control over what we perceive is far more limited than we typically assume, and that the brain will persist in its established patterns of activity regardless of whether those patterns serve any useful purpose in our current context. We have normalized this strange phenomenon so completely that it barely registers as remarkable, treating it as merely an amusing side effect of gaming rather than recognizing it as evidence that our fundamental experience of reality can be hijacked and reprogrammed through simple repetition, that our minds will continue to hallucinate familiar patterns long after logic dictates they should cease, demonstrating an uncomfortable truth about the plasticity and automaticity of human perception. The Tetris effect extends far beyond gaming, manifesting whenever we immerse ourselves intensely in any repetitive visual or cognitive task. The musician who hears phantom melodies in conversation, the taxi driver who navigates imaginary street grids through their bedroom ceiling, the data analyst whose eyes organize random patterns into spreadsheet columns, revealing that the brain's tendency to continue processing absorbed patterns is not a quirk specific to entertainment, but rather a fundamental feature of how neural systems consolidate experience into automatic perceptual frameworks, one that governs far more of our supposedly conscious perception than we care to acknowledge. This realization becomes even more unsettling when we consider that these imprinted patterns shape not merely fleeting visual hallucinations, but our deeper interpretive frameworks. The patterns we see in ambiguous social situations, the narratives we construct from incomplete information, the very architecture of our thoughts becomes unknowingly sculpted by whatever intensive experience most recently occupied our attention, suggesting that we are far less the authors of our own perceptions than we believe ourselves to be. Consider then how social media algorithms deliberately exploit this neurological vulnerability, engineering feeds of infinite scrolling patterns that imprint themselves into our attentional habits until we compulsively check our phones not from rational choice, but from the same involuntary neural firing that haunts the Tetris player's dreams, a deliberate weaponry. There exists within the human mind a peculiar tension that emerges whenever we begin something without completing it, a psychological itch that refuses to be scratched until closure has been achieved, and this phenomenon is known as the Zygarnik effect. Named after the Soviet psychologist Bluma Zygarnik, who first documented it in the 1920s, when she noticed that waiters in a restaurant could remember orders far more vividly while they were still being prepared than after the meals had been served and the transaction was complete. This observation led to a series of experiments where participants were asked to perform various tasks, some of which were interrupted before completion, and when later asked to recall what they had been doing, Those with unfinished tasks were remembered with significantly greater clarity and frequency than those that had been successfully concluded. The mechanism behind this effect operates on a fundamental level within our cognitive architecture, as the brain appears to maintain an open loop or an incomplete gestalt when a task remains undone, creating a kind of persistent activation pattern that keeps the memory and the desire for resolution at the forefront of consciousness, almost as if your mind refuses to file away the experience until it has been properly concluded and categorized. What makes this effect particularly intrusive in modern life is that we have created an environment saturated with potential interruptions and uncompleted tasks, where email inboxes remain full, notification badges glow red with unread messages, browser tabs multiply across screens, and projects linger in various states of incompletion across work and home domains, all of which trigger this same zygarnic response repeatedly throughout each day. Our minds continue to invest cognitive resources in these incomplete tasks, even when we are consciously focused on something entirely different, which means that the anxiety or distraction we feel when surrounded by unfinished business is not a character flaw or a sign of weakness, but rather the natural result of how our brains are designed to function and to seek closure. We have normalized this state of perpetual incompleteness as simply part of modern existence, accepting the constant background hum of nagging incomplete tasks as inevitable. Yet we rarely pause to consider that previous generations, with fewer potential interruptions and more linear task completion cycles, may have experienced significantly less cognitive burden from this effect, allowing their minds to rest more completely between periods of genuine work and responsibility. The recognition of this effect offers us a practical path forward. By consciously completing tasks rather than leaving them suspended, by closing browser tabs and clearing notification badges, and by establishing genuine endpoints to our work periods, we can reclaim the cognitive space that the zygarnic effect continuously occupies, allowing our minds to settle into genuine rest rather than remaining perpetually primed for resolution. The simple act of writing down a task, marking an email as read, or deliberately shutting down your computer at day's end signals to your brain that closure has been achieved, transforming the zygarnic effect from a source of persistent anxiety into a tool for genuine productivity and peace of mind. This is why the most productive and mentally peaceful individuals are often not those who accomplish the most, but rather those who have mastered the art of deliberately closing loops, finishing the email thread, completing the project milestone, or simply declaring done even when perfection remains elusive, because they understand that their cognitive energy is finite and that every unclosed loop is a. Have you ever learned a new word, and then suddenly it appears everywhere you look, in conversations, articles, and advertisements, as though the universe has conspired to place it directly in your path at every turn, only to realize weeks later that the word was always there all along and you simply never noticed it before? This phenomenon, known as the Baader-Meinhof Frequency or frequency illusion, represents one of the most subtle yet pervasive tricks your mind plays on itself, a cognitive distortion so seamless that most people never question whether their perception of increased occurrence is genuinely reflective of reality or merely a product of their own awareness. The mechanism underlying this effect involves two distinct but interconnected psychological processes working in tandem to create an illusion of pattern where statistical randomness actually reigns. First, there is the phenomenon of selective attention, whereby once your mind has latched onto something, whether a word, a concept, a name, or a particular make of automobile, your brain begins to filter incoming information in such a way that it prioritizes and highlights instances of that thing, while simultaneously ignoring the countless other stimuli competing for your conscious awareness. This is a necessary function, truly, because without selective attention your mind would be utterly overwhelmed by the cacophony of sensory information surrounding you at every moment, and you would be unable to focus on anything meaningful or important. But this same mechanism can create a profound distortion, because once you have noticed something once, your brain essentially sets up an internal search filter that begins highlighting every future occurrence of that thing, making it seem far more common than it actually is in the world. The second process at work is called confirmation bias, which is the deeply human tendency to seek out, interpret, and remember information in a way that confirms your existing beliefs and expectations, meaning that once you believe a word or concept is appearing more frequently, you will unconsciously seek out instances that support this belief while mentally discounting or forgetting instances that would contradict it. What makes the Baader-Meinhof frequency so unsettling is that it persists even when we understand exactly how it works, even when we possess the complete logical framework to recognize it as an illusion, because the mechanisms that create it operate largely below the threshold of conscious awareness and control, and no amount of intellectual knowledge seems capable of preventing your mind from falling into this trap again and again throughout your life. Perhaps this is why the Baader-Meinhof frequency feels so personal and intimate. It reveals that our perception of reality is not a faithful mirror of the world as it actually exists, but rather a deeply subjective construction shaped by the invisible architecture of our own minds, a reminder that we are always, in some fundamental sense, seeing what we expect to see rather than what is truly there. And yet, understanding this gap between perception and reality, this fundamental unreliability of our own minds, might be the most valuable insight we can gain, for it suggests that what feels abundantly true about the world may often be merely an elaborate performance staged by our own consciousness, and that the first step toward genuine wisdom is accepting how little we can truly trust our initial impressions of how frequently anything occurs. This realization becomes even more humbling when we consider how often we mistake our newfound awareness of something, a historical event, a scientific concept, a social issue, for evidence that the world itself has recently changed, when in truth we